Dr. Orson Vale pressed his boot against Bram Whitlock's chest and pushed. Not to help him, not to examine him, to hold him down while the infection spread. Bram's hand shot up and grabbed Vale's wrist, his fever-cracked lips moving. She was right, wasn't she? And Vale looked down at the dying man, the way a man looks at a bad debt he's finally about to collect on. He peeled Bram's fingers off one by one and stepped back, smoothed his coat, picked up his bag. Rest, Vale said. That's all you need. He walked out of the room. Bram Whitlock was dead by morning, and the woman who had begged Vale to listen, the woman who had seen the infection spreading 2 days before it killed her husband, spent the next 3 years being called a fraud by the very man who let Bram die. If this kind of story grips you, the kind where a woman loses everything and then fights her way back with nothing but her own hands and her own knowledge, then hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end. Give this video a like and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will make you furious before it makes you believe again. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight when Calder Rains finally admitted to himself that Nightwind wasn't going to make it to Wolf Creek. He'd been pushing the gelding too hard. He knew that even as he did it. The marshal's summons had come in the middle of the afternoon. 2 words scrawled on a wet scrap of paper shoved under his door at the boarding house in Elk Ridge. Come now. No signature, no explanation. Just those 2 words and the kind of urgency that made a man saddle up before he'd finished his coffee. The mountain trail through the Bitter Creek Pass was passable in dry weather. In a storm like this one, with the temperature dropping and the rock slick as river ice beneath Nightwind's hooves, it was something close to suicide. Calder knew that too. He kept riding anyway. He was 3 miles into the pass when it happened. Nightwind's left foreleg slid sideways on a shelf of wet granite, and the gelding went down hard on one knee before Calder could do anything except grab the saddle horn and curse. The horse scrambled upright immediately. That was the thing about Nightwind. The animal had too much pride to stay down, but the moment he put weight on that left leg, Calder felt it. That hesitation, that quarter second of wrongness before the horse took the next step. Whoa. Calder swung down from the saddle before the word was even out of his mouth. Easy. Hold still. Nightwind was shaking, not from cold, though the rain was coming sideways now and the wind had teeth in it. The horse was shaking because something hurt, and Nightwind didn't shake for anything less. Calder crouched in the mud and ran his hands down the left foreleg, pressing with his thumbs the way his father had taught him, the way 20 years of working with horses had refined into something close to instinct. The tendon along the back of the leg was hot, not just warm hot, the way a thing gets when the damage is real, and the body is already trying to fight it. Damn it, he said it quietly, because there was nobody around to hear and no point in saying it loud. Damn it, Nightwind. The horse dropped his nose against Calder's shoulder. That was something Nightwind almost never did. The gelding had come to Calder 2 years ago, half wild, and entirely unwilling to trust anyone who hadn't earned it 20 times over. That nose on his shoulder meant the horse was scared, and a scared Nightwind was a horse in serious pain. Calder stood up and looked around. The trail behind him was already running with water. The trail ahead curved up into the worst of the pass, a section of narrow switchbacks where a horse with a sound leg could lose his footing in weather like this. Nightwind wasn't going forward. Going back wasn't much better. Standing still in the middle of a mountain in a Montana November storm while the temperature kept dropping was a way to lose a horse and possibly a man. Then he saw the light. It wasn't much a yellow smear through the rain, down off the trail maybe a quarter mile, tucked against the slope where a stand of pine trees broke some of the wind. But it was a light and it was steady, and in Calder's experience, a steady light in bad weather meant someone who was either very stubborn or very capable had decided that light was important enough to maintain. He clicked his tongue softly. Come on, nice and slow. Nightwind followed him off the trail and down the slope, picking his way carefully, favoring the leg but not refusing to move. That was something. A horse that refused to move was a horse that had already given up, and Nightwind hadn't given up yet. Calder intended to make sure that meant something. The descent took 20 minutes that felt like an hour. The rain didn't let up. By the time Calder could make out the shape of the buildings, a main house, a large barn, 3 smaller outbuildings arranged with the careful logic of someone who'd thought hard about how a working ranch actually needed to function. He was soaked through to his skin and night winds. Breathing had taken on a careful quality that worried him. There was a woman standing in the doorway of the barn. She wasn't holding a lantern. She had both hands free, and she was watching him come down the slope with a particular kind of stillness that meant she'd already made several decisions about him before he'd gotten close enough for her to see his face clearly. "Marshal," she said, when he was close enough to hear her over the rain. She was looking at his badge, pinned crookedly to his coat, because he'd dressed in a hurry. "That's a U.S. Marshal's badge." "Deputy Marshal," Calder said. "Calder Rains. My horse came down on wet rock up in the pass. He's hurt, and I need shelter for the night, if you've got it. Pay whatever you ask." The woman's gaze moved immediately to Nightwind. Not to Calder's face, not to the badge, to the horse. Came down off the barn step and walked toward Nightwind with her hands open at her sides, moving slowly the way a person moves when they know that a scared animal reads intention before it reads anything else. Nightwind rolled one eye toward her and snorted that low, warning sound that usually preceded a bite or a kick, and then stopped. He stopped and watched her come, and when she put her hand flat against his neck, he didn't pull away. Calder stood in the rain and watched this, and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. She crouched in the mud beside the left foreleg, no hesitation, no concern for her skirt or the wet ground, and began examining the leg with both hands. Fingers moved, with a precision that wasn't learned from books. That was the work of who'd done this 1,000 times, and knew what she was looking for before she found it. "Strained tendon," she said. "Front of the suspensory, maybe the branch. He needs to stay off it." She stood and looked at Calder directly for the first time. Her eyes were a color he couldn't quite name in the rain-dark light, somewhere between green and hazel, and sharp enough that he felt them like a physical thing. 3 weeks minimum before he carries a rider. "I need to be in Wolf Creek by tomorrow," Calder said. "Your horse needs his leg more than Wolf Creek needs you." She said it without apology or irritation, the way someone states a fact they have no particular interest in arguing about. "Bring him inside. I've got a clean stall and I'll put a cold compress on the tendon tonight. We can assess again in the morning, but 3 weeks is 3 weeks, Marshal." "Deputy Marshal, 3 weeks is still 3 weeks." Calder looked at her for a moment. He looked at Nightwind, who had dropped his nose again, this time toward the woman's shoulder, not his. He looked at the rain, which showed no interest in stopping. "Calder Rains," he said again, this time as an introduction rather than an identification. "Lenora Whitlock." She turned and walked back toward the barn, without waiting to see if he'd follow. "Bring your horse." The barn was warm. That was the first thing the warmth hit him, like something physical after the cold of the trail, the smell of hay and animals and lamp oil, the sound of horses moving quietly in their stalls. There were more horses than Calder had expected. A dozen at least, maybe more, and not a single one of them in particularly good condition. A bay gelding with his ribs showing more than they should. A gray mare with a bandaged hock. A sorrel with a badly healed scar along his flank that suggested someone had let a wound go too long before treating it. "These aren't your working horses," Calder said. "No." Lenora was already clearing the end stall, moving efficiently without hurry. "They're the ones nobody else wanted. Come on, bring him in." He led Nightwind into the stall. The gelding went quietly, which was not normal. Nightwind hated unfamiliar stalls, and usually expressed this by refusing to enter them until he'd examined every corner twice. He walked in behind Lenora and stood still while she began preparing the compress. "You've got a way with horses," Calder said. "I grew up with them." She worked while she talked, hands busy, her attention mostly on Nightwind. "My father bred quarter horses in Wyoming. I could diagnose a hoof abscess by sound before I was 12. Who taught you about tendon injuries?" She glanced at him over her shoulder. There was something in that glance, not hostility, but a kind of careful measurement, like she was deciding how much to say. "Nobody taught me," she said finally. "I read, I watched. I made mistakes. I learned from them. That's how most things worth knowing actually get learned." Vale would disagree with you. The name came out before Calder had thought about whether to say it. He'd heard about Lenora Whitlock in Wolf Creek, not the whole story, but pieces of it. The way pieces of stories always floated around in territories where news traveled by word of mouth and got distorted with every retelling. He knew there'd been a husband. He knew there'd been a doctor. He knew the outcome had been bad. Lenora went very still for a moment. Just a moment. Then her hands resumed their work. Doctor Vale, she said, knows a great deal about what he wants people to believe. Is that different from what he knows? She didn't answer that. She applied the compress to Nightwind's leg and secured it with practiced efficiency, then straightened and wiped her hands on a cloth hanging from the stall gate. I'll bring you something dry to wear. There's a room off the kitchen, nothing fancy, but the roof doesn't leak. You're welcome to it. I appreciate that, Mrs. Whitlock. Lenora, she picked up her lamp. If you're staying 3 weeks, Mrs. Whitlock is going to get tiresome. She walked out of the barn, and Calder stood in the warm stall with his hand on Nightwind's neck and thought that he'd just met a woman who was either the most self-possessed person he'd encountered in 20 years of law enforcement or the loneliest. He was starting to think it might be both. He slept better than he expected to, and worse than he needed to. The room off the kitchen was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a quilt that smelled like cedar, and at some point in the early morning hours the rain finally stopped. When he woke, the world outside the window was silent and gray, the mountains showing through clearing clouds like something that had been hiding and decided to stop. Lenora was already in the barn. Calder found her removing the compress from Nightwind's leg, examining the tendon in the early light with the focused attention of someone conducting a serious evaluation. She'd replaced her dress from the night before with a work shirt and trousers, her hair pulled back simply, and she looked more herself this way, or what Calder's instinct told him was more herself, though he couldn't have explained the basis for that assessment. How is he? Calder asked from the doorway. Better than last night. Worse than he needs to be before he can work. She didn't look up. The swellings has come down some. That's good. But you pushed him hard before the fall, I can tell by the wear patterns on his other legs. He was tired before the tendon went. Calder came inside. It was urgent. So urgent that you'd risk a horse that trusts you? He didn't have a good answer to that, so he didn't offer one. Can I help with the morning feeding? She did look up then, and again that measuring quality in her eyes, the assessment of someone who'd been disappointed enough times to have stopped giving automatic benefit of the doubt. You know how to work a barn? I spent 9 years trail bossing before I pinned on the badge. So yes, I know how to work a barn. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite a smile, more like the adjustment a person makes when information they've received doesn't match what they expected. Hay is in the left corner. Each horse gets a flake and a half. The gray mare gets double. She's been underfed since I got her, and she's not back up to weight yet. Don't get too close to the bay gelding on the end. He bites. Does he bite you? He tried once. What happened? I bit him back. She said it without inflection, returned her attention to Nightwind's leg. Calder laughed genuinely, unexpectedly, the kind of laugh that escapes before you've decided to allow it. He went and got the hay. The river crossing had been destroyed by the storm. He discovered this mid-morning when he rode the ranch's old quarter horse out to assess the situation borrowed, because Nightwind was under strict orders to stand still and be pampered, and found the ford he normally used washed out. The banks collapsed, the water running fast and brown and well above its normal channel. He sat on the borrowed horse and looked at the river, and understood that he was, for better or worse, genuinely stuck. When he got back to the ranch, Lenora was in the small pasture behind the barn, working with the sorrel, the scarred one on a lunge line. She was moving the horse in circles, watching his movement, her voice a low, steady murmur that Calder couldn't make out from the fence. The sorrel was nervous, his ears working constantly, his body tight with the particular tension of an animal that had been hurt badly enough that it expected everything to hurt. But he was following her. Nervous and tense and halfway prepared to bolt, he was still following her. Calder watched for a few minutes before saying anything. River's out. I'm not going anywhere for a while. Lenora didn't stop the sorrel. I know. The ford's been washing out in November storms since I've been here. It'll be passable again in 5 or 6 days, depending on rain. 6 days then. Possibly longer. He leaned on the fence. You're not surprised. I'm not anything, she said. You can stay or you can find another way out. But if you're staying, there's work to do and I could use another pair of hands. I'm not running a boarding house, I'm running a recovery facility, and these animals need attention. If you want to earn your keep, you can. And if I don't want to earn my keep, then stay out of my way. The sorrel shied at something, a bird, a shadow, and she brought him back with a steady pull in that same low murmur. Your choice, Marshal, Deputy Marshal Calder said, and I'll work. The days settled into a rhythm that surprised him with how quickly it felt natural. He was up before light, feeding the horses alongside Lenora, then moving through whatever needed doing, fence repairs, the perpetual maintenance a working ranch required, hauling water when the pump ran slow, assisting with treatments as Lenora directed. She was specific and unfussy about assistance. Hold this. Hand me that. Keep him still. Watch what I do here because I may need you to do it next time. She was not, it turned out, a woman who spent time on pleasantries. But she wasn't cold. She was something more interesting than either warmth or coldness. She was simply direct, in a way that felt like respect rather than indifference. She told him what she needed. She told him what she knew. She told him when he was doing something wrong, and she told him when he was doing it right, and she applied the same standards to herself. On the third day, she lanced an abscess on the bay gelding's hoof. The horse was dangerous. Calder had already confirmed that firsthand, after it tried to take a piece out of his forearm, and lancing an abscess required getting close, staying close, and maintaining pressure during the part that hurt. Calder held the horse and Lenora worked, and the bay fought them both, and it was messy and loud, and nothing about it was gentle or easy. When it was over, the bay stood with his head down and breathed, and Lenora cleaned her instruments, and Calder pressed a cloth against the shallow bite mark on his forearm, and they looked at each other across the horse's back. Both of them sweaty and dirty, and slightly worse for it. You held well, she said. Most men try to fight a horse when it fights them. You just held. Fighting a scared horse gives it more to be scared of. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Where did you learn that? My grandfather raised horses in Tennessee. He said the same thing applied to people. Lenora considered this. Then she went back to cleaning her instruments, and that was that. But something had shifted slightly, some small increment in a measurement he couldn't name. It was on the fifth evening, when they were sitting by the small fire in the kitchen, after the barn work was done, that the real story came out. Not all of it at once. It came in pieces, the way difficult things always come sideways, attached to other subjects, retreating when it got too close, and then returning from a different angle. Calder had asked about the sorrel where she'd gotten him, what his history was, and Lenora had answered that a rancher 3 valleys over had wanted the horse destroyed after the accident that caused the scar. The horse had been spooked by something, thrown the rancher's son. The son hadn't been seriously hurt, but the rancher had decided the horse was dangerous, and that dangerous horses weren't worth the cost of their feed. But he's not dangerous, Calder said. He's scared. Yes. Lenora stared at the fire. That's what I said. The rancher didn't agree. He said I didn't know what I was talking about, and that scared horses and dangerous horses were the same thing. A pause. He used to say the same thing about me, that I was hysterical and didn't know what I was talking about. Calder waited. Bram, she said, and the name sat in the air between them. My husband, 3 years ago. She picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, put it down. He had a riding accident. Nothing dramatic, a stumble, a fall, a wound on his forearm from a fence post. It didn't even bleed much. But I watched the wound over the next 2 days, and I knew something was wrong. The skin around it was changing color. He was running a fever that came and went. I'd seen that pattern before in horses in the early stages of infection before it spreads deep. She stopped. Calder didn't fill the silence. I brought Doctor Vale in on the second day. I told him what I was seeing and what I thought it meant. He examined Bram for about 5 minutes, told me the wound was healing normally, told me I was letting my worry get the better of my judgment. He said women often catastrophized illness in their husbands. Her voice was even, but that evenness had weight to it, the weight of something that had been pressed flat a very long time. He prescribed a tonic and bed rest. He told me to stop hovering. And you knew he was wrong. I knew what I was seeing. And what I was seeing was not a man healing normally. She finally looked at Calder. I sent for Vale again on the fourth day. Bram was worse. A lot worse. His arm was swollen halfway to the elbow, the skin was red and hot, and he was confused, that confused quality that comes with high fever. Vale came, looked at him, told me I was overreacting and that the fever would break naturally. Her jaw set briefly. Bram died on the 6th day. By then the infection had gone everywhere. There was nothing to be done. I'm sorry, Calder said. He meant it, which sometimes mattered. After Bram died, I told people what had happened. What Vale had dismissed. I said I believed he'd made a serious error, that he'd failed to recognize an infection that was treatable in its early stages. She exhaled slowly. Vale is a respected man. He's been practicing in this territory for 20 years. He has friends in every town for 50 miles. When I said he'd been wrong, he didn't argue with me directly. Talked. To people at church, at the feed store, at the cattlemen's meetings. He said I was a grieving woman who'd fixated on blame. He said I'd been trying to practice medicine. I wasn't qualified to practice. He said my husband had died of a complication no one could have predicted, and that I was too irrational with grief to accept that. And people believed him. Why wouldn't they? She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness. He's the doctor. I'm the widow with ideas above her station. He has a degree on the wall, and I have calluses on my hands from working with animals. She picked up her coffee cup again. So I stopped talking to people about it. I came out here and I work with the horses nobody else wants. And I try not to think too much about what Bram might have said if someone had actually listened to me in time. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had come up again, not storm strength, just the ordinary wind of a Montana November night. What did Vale do after? Calder asked. After you stopped talking. Lenora looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, what did he do? Not what did people say. Not what did you do, what did Vale do. A man who goes to that much trouble to discredit someone is usually protecting something specific. She was quiet for a long moment, and in that quiet he saw the first crack in the careful evenness she'd been maintaining, not emotion exactly, but the shape of a thought she'd been sitting with for a long time, without anyone to put it to. I don't know, she said slowly. I've thought about it. I've thought that Bram's accident happened during the calving season at the Dern Ranch, Silas Dern, who runs the biggest breeding operation in the valley. Bram was helping out there that week. He mentioned that one of Dern's bulls had been acting wrong, lethargic, off his feed, and that he'd said something to Dern about it. She shook her head. But that's probably nothing. That's just me looking for patterns where there aren't any. Calder said nothing, but he stored it the name Silas Dern, the sick bull, the timing of Bram's accident, stored it the way a deputy marshal stores things that don't add up yet but might add up later. I'm sorry about Bram, he said again. So am I. She stood, picked up both their cups. Get some sleep, Calder. The gray mare needs her bandage changed at first light, and she's particular about it. He watched her carry the cups to the basin and understood something he hadn't expected to understand this early in what he'd believed would be a 3-day inconvenience. Lenora Whitlock was not a woman who'd been broken by what happened to her. She was a woman who'd been driven inward by it, pulled back behind a gate she'd constructed herself, tending what she could reach, refusing to want what she'd learned cost too much. That was a different thing entirely. And it sat in him that night, after he'd gone back to the narrow bed with the cedar quilt, in a way that wasn't comfortable and wasn't easy, and felt a great deal like the beginning of something he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for. On the 8th day, 3 horses collapsed. Calder was repairing a section of fence along the creek bank when he heard Lenora's voice, not a scream. She was not a woman who screamed, but a sharp call of his name with an urgency in it that brought him running before he'd processed the sound. The horses were in the lower pasture, 2 of her recovering animals, and 1 belonging to a neighboring rancher named Hadley, who'd boarded the horse with her for treatment. All 3 were down on their sides within minutes of each other, their breathing wrong, their legs moving with the uncoordinated quality of animals that had lost control of their own bodies. Lenora was already with them. Poisoning, she said without looking up. Look at the symptoms. It's not colic. It's not a respiratory infection. This is something they ingested. The creek water, Calder said immediately. He'd been working along the creek bank all morning. The water had looked slightly different, a quality of it, a color he'd noticed without registering as significant. Yes, something upstream. She was moving between the horses, her hands steady, her voice flat with the particular flatness of someone who's not panicking because they need to think. I need charcoal from the kitchen, it's in the tin by the stove, and my emergency kit from the second shelf in the barn. Go. He went. By the time he came back, she'd gotten the worst affected horse Hadley's animal, a good-looking chestnut, onto his chest and was keeping him there. Activated charcoal for poisoning. It was what you do for a human, too. Calder had seen it done exactly once, 15 years ago, by a rancher's wife who'd read the same things Lenora had clearly read, and who'd saved her husband's life in the process. They worked for 2 hours. Hadley's horse was the most serious. The two of Lenora's recovering animals pulled through faster, perhaps because their systems were stronger than they looked, perhaps because she knew their baseline well enough to catch the change early. The chestnut was touch and go for 40 minutes, long enough that Calder found himself thinking things he didn't particularly want to think about yet, things about what it would mean for Lenora if Hadley's horse died. The horse lived. When it was over, Lenora sat back on her heels in the pasture mud and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. Just breathed for about 30 seconds. Then she stood. I need to go upstream, Calder said. I know. You should come. She looked at him. Why? Because whatever I find up there, you need to see it yourself. Not take my word for it. He paused. You've had enough of taking men's word for things. Her jaw tightened slightly. Then she nodded. They found it half a mile upstream, where a tributary fed into the main creek, a section of bank where something had been poured deliberately, the ground around it still wet with it, the vegetation immediately downstream already yellowing. Calder crouched and looked at it carefully without touching. The smell was faint but distinctive. Someone did this intentionally, he said. Yes. Lenora was standing very still behind him. Yes, they did. Have you had other problems here? Before tonight. A silence that was slightly too long to be simple recollection. Twice this fall, fences went down in sections that don't usually fail. I thought it was weather. And a month ago, a man came by asking if I'd thought about selling the ranch. He wasn't rude about it. He was almost friendly, but he came back twice more when I said no. Who sent him? He said he was representing a purchasing group. He didn't name one. She looked at the yellowed vegetation along the creek bank. I should have thought harder about that. Calder stood up. Do you know a man named Silas Dern well enough to have made an enemy of him? Lenora looked at him sharply. Why? Because you mentioned his name 9 days ago in a context that I've been thinking about since. And because a man whose breeding operation depends on keeping his animals' health records clean has a very specific reason to want the only person in this valley who can actually diagnose a sick horse from a distance to be somewhere other than here. The color had left her face. Not fear, Lenora Whitlock didn't frighten easily. He was learning that, but the particular pallor of a woman who's just had a suspicion she'd told herself was paranoid confirmed as something with substance. Vale and Dern, she said. You think they're connected. I think they've always been connected, and I think you've been inconvenient to them for 3 years, and now you're becoming a problem. He looked at her steadily. Whoever poured that into your creek didn't do it to kill horses. They did it to give people a reason to say your horses were dying. And once people are saying your horses are dying, they stop bringing animals here. Her voice was quiet. And if Hadley's horse had died tonight, Hadley would have told everyone in the valley, and they wouldn't have stopped at saying it. No, Calder said. They wouldn't. The creek ran beside them, carrying the tainted water away now, diluting it. But it had already done what it was meant to do. 3 horses were alive, because Lenora had recognized the signs in time, and because Calder had run fast, and because they'd both known what to do. None of that would matter much if no one believed it. Calder looked at the woman standing beside the poisoned creek bank in the late afternoon light, her hands dirty, her face pale, her eyes doing the complicated work of putting a picture together from pieces that had been scattered across 3 years and a dead husband and a doctor who'd lied. I need you to trust me, he said. She looked at him for a long time. That's a large ask, Calder. I know it is. Another long moment. The water moved past them, and the wind moved through the pines on the slope above, and somewhere behind them in the pasture, the chestnut horse got his legs under him and stood. I know, Lenora said. I know it is. She didn't say yes. But she didn't say no. And Calder Rains, who had spent 20 years reading the silences between a person's words, understood that in Lenora Whitlock's language, that was close enough to a beginning. Hadley came out to the ranch 2 days after his horse nearly died, and he didn't come alone. He brought his brother-in-law, a thick-necked man named Cord, who ran a small cattle operation along the South Ridge, and he brought his neighbor Peterson, who had 3 draft horses and a reputation for saying whatever came into his head, without pausing to think about whether it was accurate. They rode in together mid-morning, while Calder was splitting wood at the side of the barn, and Lenora was inside examining the chestnut's recovery. Calder heard the horses come through the gate and put down the axe. He didn't move toward the house. He just stood where he was and watched the 3 men dismount, and something in the way, they moved the way Cord kept his hands loose, and Peterson's chin was up higher than it needed to be told him this wasn't a social call. Lenora came out of the barn before any of them spoke. She'd heard them too, apparently, or she'd been watching from the window. Came out with her sleeves rolled and her hands clean, and she looked at Hadley with the particular expression of a woman who spent enough time being surprised by people that she stopped bothering with the surprised part. Hadley, she said. Lenora. He took his hat off. He was a big man, Hadley, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending 60 years outdoors and not one of them easy. He wasn't unkind. Calder had gathered that from how Lenora talked about him, or rather didn't talk about him, which was its own kind of information. He was just a man of his time, which meant he was accustomed to a certain ordering of things. And a woman who knew more than the doctor made him uncomfortable in a way he'd never examined closely enough to understand. Came to check on Redbone. Redbone is doing well. He's eating, he's putting weight on all 4 legs, his eyes are clear. You can see him if you'd like. We'd like, Cord said. He was looking at Calder. Who's he? Deputy Marshal, Calder said. Calder Rains, out of Wolf Creek. What's a deputy marshal doing on Lenora's ranch? My horse is recovering from a tendon injury, Mrs. Whitlock is treating him. Calder kept his voice easy. Good at it. Cord looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether an answer is complete enough or whether he needs to poke at it further. Then he looked back at Lenora. Heard your horses got sick. Heard some died. None died, Lenora said. 3 went down. All 3 recovered. Peterson says a lot of things. She said it calmly, without heat, and Peterson had the grace to look slightly away. 3 horses developed symptoms of poisoning after drinking from the lower creek. I treated them. They recovered. A deputy marshal investigated the creek and found evidence of deliberate contamination upstream from my property. That landed differently than Cord had expected. He looked at Calder again. Deliberate. Someone poured something into a tributary feeding the main creek, Calder said. I've documented the site and I've taken samples. I'm waiting on an identification from the territorial office. He paused. Whoever did it knew the timing of when the horses would be in the lower pasture. That's not random. A silence settled over the group. Peterson had stopped looking away. Hadley was turning his hat in his hands, which Calder read as a man thinking harder than he was comfortable with. Why would someone poison Lenora's water? Hadley said. It wasn't a challenge exactly. It was an actual question. The question of a man who'd just had his preferred version of events complicated. That, Calder said, is what I'm working on. Lenora moved toward the barn. Come see Redbone, Hadley. He'll be ready to go home in another 10 days. Hadley followed her. Cord followed Hadley. Peterson stood where he was for a moment, looking at Calder with an expression that was trying to be something skepticism, maybe, or the aggressive uncertainty of a man who'd said things he might need to unsay, and then he followed the others. Calder picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. He wasn't naive enough to think that 3 men arriving with doubt in their eyes and leaving with slightly less of it counted as a victory. But it was a beginning. The problem was, he was becoming increasingly certain that Dern wasn't waiting for him to build a case. The poisoning had been a test. If it had worked, if Hadley's horse had died, if word had spread the right way, the ranch would already be bleeding customers. It hadn't worked, which meant whoever was directing this would try something else, and try it soon. That night, after the lamp was low and the horses were settled, Calder sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote down everything he knew, everything he suspected, and everything that connected the two. It was a habit from his years. As a trail boss, the ledger habit, his grandfather had called it. Write it down. The act of writing changes how you see it. What he had was this. Silas Dern ran the largest horse breeding operation in the territory, which meant he had the most to lose from anyone who could accurately assess equine health. Dr. Vale had been the valley's veterinary authority for 20 years, which meant every sale Dern made that involved any kind of health certification had gone through Vale. Lenora's husband Bram had died of an infection Vale had failed to treat, and Bram's accident had happened at Dern's ranch during a week when at least one of Dern's animals had been behaving abnormally. Lenora's growing reputation even isolated. Even working only with animals, nobody else wanted threatened the entire arrangement. A man who could falsify health records could also sell sick horses as sound ones. A veterinarian who had a financial interest in doing so had every reason to. And a widow who could diagnose what those horses were really suffering from a distance, by watching them move, was the most dangerous kind of witness there was, the kind who didn't know yet exactly what she'd seen. Calder looked at what he'd written for a long time. Then he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and sat in the quiet kitchen and listened to the ranch settle around him in the dark, the way old places do wood contracting, something small moving in the walls, the distant sound of a horse shifting in his stall. He thought about Lenora's voice when she'd said, "I know it is," and the way she hadn't said yes but hadn't said no, and the particular discipline it took to be that careful with hope after it had cost you as much as it had cost her. He blew out the lamp and went to bed. He didn't sleep well, but that was becoming normal. The river dropped to passable on the 11th day. Calder stood at the edge of the ford in the early morning and looked at the water and understood that he had a decision to make. His deputy in Wolf Creek, a young man named Aldous Breen, who was capable enough with routine matters and genuinely out of his depth with anything that wasn't routine, had by now been managing alone for nearly 2 weeks. There was almost certainly something that needed attending to. There was almost certainly a pile of correspondence, and at least one situation that Aldous had handled well enough to avoid disaster, but not well enough to resolve. The river was passable. Nightwind was not. Lenora had examined the tendon that morning with the same careful precision she brought to everything, pressing, testing, watching the horse's response. Swelling was mostly gone, the heat was reduced. But the tendon wasn't ready, and Lenora had a particular way of saying things weren't ready that brooked no argument, not because she was harsh about it, but because she was right, and she knew she was right, and she had stopped apologizing for knowing things. "Another week," she'd said. "The river's down," Calder had said. Tendon doesn't care about the river. She'd looked up at him briefly. You could borrow the quarter horse again. Get back to Wolf Creek, deal with whatever needs dealing with, come back for Nightwind in a week. He'd looked at her. She'd kept her eyes on the horse. "Come back," he said. "For Nightwind," she said, "yes." Pause that both of them understood, contained more than the word it was attached to. "That's your decision," she said. "The quarter horse is sound for the distance." He'd left the ford without deciding anything and walked back to the ranch and spent the morning helping her rewrap the gray mare's hock and listening to Lenora explain the particular reasoning behind the technique she was using, the angle of the wrap, the pressure distribution, the need to check for swelling above the joint, and not just at the site of the injury. She taught without performing. That was the thing. Some people who knew a great deal made you aware at all times that they knew it. Lenora just talked about what she was doing and why, the same way she'd talk about what she was making for supper, and somehow, in the middle of that, you learned things without feeling like you were being educated. "How do you know all this?" he asked, at some point in the middle of the gray mare's hock treatment. "I don't mean the horses. I mean all of it. The poisoning treatment last week, the charcoal, the positioning, the timing. Where does that come from?" Lenora was quiet for a moment. "After Bram died, I read everything I could find. Every medical text I could order, every veterinary manual, every pamphlet from the livestock associations. I had a lot of evenings with nothing to fill them." She smoothed the final layer of the wrap. "At first, I told myself I was trying to understand what happened. Whether I was wrong and Vale was right. Whether there was any version of what I'd seen that I'd misread." She sat back. "I wasn't wrong. No," Calder said. "I don't think you were. But reading everything, trying to determine one thing, It turns out you can't read selectively when it comes to medicine. You read one thing, and it connects to 3 others, and those connect to 10 more, and suddenly you have a picture of how animals and people suffer and heal that you didn't have before. She looked at the gray mare with something that wasn't quite fondness and wasn't quite pride, something in between. This one had a tendon injury that was treated wrong and re-injured twice before she came to me. Her previous owners kept thinking she was better before she was and putting her back to work. Every time they did that, they added another layer of damage. Patient, Calder said. Too much patience becomes its own damage, Lenora said. The art is knowing when waiting is healing and when it's just postponing the inevitable. She stood and dusted her hands. Are you going back to Wolf Creek today? He looked at her. No. She nodded once, the nod of a woman filing that information without showing her reaction to it. Then there's a section of the north fence that's been giving me trouble for a month. If you're looking for something useful to do, he went and fixed the fence. The message came on the 14th day, delivered by a boy of about 12 on a spotted pony who arrived at the ranch gate at mid-afternoon, looking important in the way 12-year-olds look when they've been given a task by an adult. Letter for the marshal, the boy said. Deputy Marshal, Calder said, and took the letter. It was from Aldous, written in Aldous' particular combination of good grammar and poor spelling. It conveyed that the situation in Wolf Creek was manageable, but that there had been 2 complaints filed regarding property near the Dern holdings on the north end of the valley. That a man named Urquette had been asking around about the deputy marshal's whereabouts in a way Aldous found unsettling without being able to explain why. And that the territorial office had sent a query regarding a water rights dispute that Aldous genuinely did not know how to respond to. Calder read this 3 times and gave the boy a coin and watched him ride away. He sat on the fence near the barn and thought about the name Urquette. He'd heard it before, not often, but in a specific context. Urquette was a name that people associated with Silas Dern, not because Urquette worked for Dern openly, but because whenever Dern had business that wasn't exactly the kind you announced, Urquette seemed to be in the general vicinity of it. And Urquette was asking about where Calder was. He folded the letter and went inside and found Lenora at the kitchen table, going over her records, the careful logs she kept of each animal's treatment, progress, setbacks. Kind of documentation that nobody had asked for, and she'd maintained anyway because she was a person who believed in the act of writing things down. He sat down across from her and put the letter on the table between them. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked up from her records. Then tell me. He told her. All of it, what he'd written down that first night, the connection between Vale and Dern he'd been building, the logic of what they were protecting, and why the poisoning made sense within that logic. He told her about Urquette. He told her what he thought was coming. Lenora listened without interrupting. That was another thing about her, she didn't interrupt, didn't fill silences with reassurance or argument, just listened with the focused quality of someone taking in information they intend to use. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You think the poisoning was the beginning, not the main event. Yes. And you think they know you're here. Urquette asking about me suggests they know I haven't come back yet. Whether they know why, whether they know Nightwind is here, and what that means for the timeline, I can't say for certain. He looked at her steadily. But I think we need to assume they know more than is comfortable. What do you need from me? He looked at her records spread across the table. You keep logs on every animal. Yes. Do you have records going back to when Bram died? Anything about the horses at Dern's operation that season? Anything Bram mentioned that you wrote down? She was very still. Why? Because if Dern has been selling sick horses as healthy ones, and Vale has been signing the certificates, and Bram noticed something in the week before his accident, then what you have written in those logs might be more important than you know. She stood up slowly and went to the shelf along the far wall, where a row of notebooks sat in chronological order, the careful record of 3 years of work and 1 marriage before it. She pulled out 2 that were older than the rest and brought them back to the table. I wrote everything down, she said, after Bram died. Every conversation we'd had in those last weeks. Everything he'd mentioned about the Dern Ranch. Everything I'd observed about his injury and the progression. She set the notebooks down. I wrote it down because I knew nobody would believe me, And I thought if there was ever a way to, she stopped. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew I couldn't not write it down. Calder opened the first notebook. Her handwriting was small and precise, and in places slightly uneven, which he understood was the places where she'd been writing through something difficult. The entries from the week of Bram's death were dense every symptom, every conversation with Vale, every time she'd asked and been dismissed. It was the documentation of a woman who'd known nobody would listen and had refused to let that stop her from bearing witness. Lenora, he looked up at her. This is evidence. Of what? My husband dying while the doctor ignored me? Of the pattern. Of what Vale knew when he knew it and what he did instead. He turned a page. And if what Bram told you about the Dern animals connects to what Vale later certified as healthy, he found the entry he was looking for, a week before Bram's death. Bram said the big roan gelding at Dern's has been off his feed for 10 days and running a slight fever. He mentioned it to Dern, and Dern told him Vale had looked at the horse and cleared it. Bram said Vale wasn't there that day that he'd asked, and none of the hands had seen Vale come out. He was falsifying inspections he never conducted. Color had left her face again. Vale certified animals he never examined. It looks like it. Which means every horse Dern sold with a Vale certification could have been sold with fraudulent health documentation. Calder closed the notebook carefully. And the one person who could potentially testify to what Bram witnessed was a grieving widow who'd already been publicly discredited. Lenora sat down. Not heavily, she wasn't a woman who did things heavily, but with the particular deliberateness of someone whose legs have made a decision before the rest of them caught up. He let Bram die. I can't prove that yet, but you think it. Calder was quiet for a moment. I think that a man with enough to hide does calculations. And I think the calculation Vale made when Bram came in with that wound was that treating the infection aggressively would require attention, and attention would bring questions. And questions about what Bram had seen at Dern's ranch in the week before his accident were questions Orson Vale did not want anyone asking. Lenora looked at the notebooks on the table. She'd carried this for 3 years, the suspicion, the helplessness, the unbearable clarity of knowing something was wrong and being told, over and over, by people who had more authority than she did, that she was wrong for knowing it. What do we do? She said. I need to get to Wolf Creek and get Aldous moving on the property complaint filings. Those could give us grounds to subpoena Dern's business records. And I need you to make copies of those notebooks. The originals stay hidden, somewhere nobody would look. He paused. Is there somewhere on this property that isn't obvious? She thought for a moment. There's a hollowed section of the main barn post the back left corner. I've kept money there. No one has ever found it. Good. Put the originals there and make me copies to take. He stood. I'll borrow the quarter horse. I'll be back in 3 days. She looked up at him. Something in her expression shifted, not fear, and not the careful blankness she used when she was protecting herself from something. Something more unguarded than either. Be careful, she said. I'm always careful. You rode a good horse over a mountain in a November storm because someone wrote you 2 words on a piece of paper. He almost smiled. That's different, is it? He looked at her for a moment, the notebooks on the table, her hands flat on either side of them, the lamplight on her face, doing something to her eyes that made that impossible color even harder to name. I'll be back in 3 days, he said. He left before either of them could say something that would make 3 days feel longer than it already did. Wolf Creek received him with the particular welcome of a town that's been managing without someone and is not entirely willing to admit it needed them. Aldous met him at the door of the marshal's office with an expression of barely contained relief, dressed up as professional composure. He was 24 years old and genuinely trying, which Calder had always thought was most of what you could ask. Glad you're back, Aldous said. The Dern property complaint, there are 2 families who say Dern's men have been moving boundary markers. Tell me everything. He sat with Aldous for 2 hours, going through everything that had accumulated in 2 weeks. Property complaints were real and documented 2 separate families on the north end of the valley, and what Aldous had initially logged as a boundary dispute was starting to look like something more systematic. Both families had water access that ran across land adjacent to Dern's holdings. Both families had received recent offers to sell at below market prices. Both had declined. Get me the original land grants, Calder said. The territorial records, not whatever copies Dern's people would have filed. And I want you to take a ride out to those 2 properties and look at the boundary markers yourself. Don't talk to Dern's men. Just look. What am I looking for? Evidence of recent disturbance. Fresh dirt around posts. Markers that don't match the age of the surrounding land. He stood. And Urquette. Someone said he was asking about me. Aldis's composure got slightly less composed. He was in the saloon 3 nights ago. Talking to people. Asking how long you'd been gone. Whether anyone had heard from you. What did people say? Far as I know, nobody knew exactly where you were. One of the men from Elk Ridge mentioned you'd headed into the pass before the storm, but nobody had seen you come through Wolf Creek. Which meant Dern knew he'd gone into the pass and hadn't come out the other side, but didn't know where he'd ended up. That was something, though Calder wasn't sure yet exactly what kind of something. He spent the night in his own bed for the first time in 2 weeks. And it was wider than the narrow bed at the ranch, and the quilt didn't smell like cedar, and he slept worse than he had any night since Nightwind went down on the mountain. He didn't examine that too carefully. In the morning, he sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office and another to the land registry, and he collected Aldis's documentation on the property complaints. And he went to see a woman named Harriet Bledsoe, who had been in Wolf Creek for 30 years and remembered everything, and had no particular reason to protect anyone. Harriet was in her 70s and sharp as a new blade, and she received him in her parlor with coffee and the efficient hospitality of a woman who was interested in whatever he'd come to ask about. "Silas Dern," she said when he got to the point. "What do you want to know?" "How long has he been here?" 12 years. Came up from Nevada with money already made and bought the Harker land before old Harker's body was cold." She set her cup down. "He's always been careful. Dern is. He doesn't do things that look wrong until you add them up." "And Vale?" Harriet was quiet for a moment. "Vale came 5 years before Dern. He was a good doctor in the early years. I believed that then, and I still believe it. He wasn't always what he became." She looked at Calder steadily. "He became what he became gradually, the way a man does when someone offers him enough to look the other way once, and then twice, and then it becomes so ordinary he's forgotten. There was a time when he looked straight ahead." "Did you know Bram Whitlock?" "Of course. Good man. Better than most." Her voice didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "And I know what people said about Lenora after he died. I said it myself to my shame. Vale was very convincing, and I was lazy, and She paused. She made people uncomfortable. A woman who knew too much and wasn't quiet enough about knowing it. "She was right," Calder said. "I'm beginning to think so." Harriet looked at him with the assessing quality of a woman who'd been reading people for 7 decades and rarely got it wrong. "You've been out there with her. My horse is recovering at her ranch." "Is that all?" It wasn't a question. Calder kept his expression neutral. "She's treating 3 other injured animals, maintaining a property alone, and documenting everything she knows about Vale and Dern. Doing all of that while someone's trying to drive her out." He stood. "I'm going to need help from people in this town who are willing to look straight ahead." Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come back here this evening. I'll have people here worth talking to." He came back that evening and found 6 people in Harriet Bledsoe's parlor, a mix of ranchers, a feed merchant, a woman who ran the telegraph office and therefore knew more about what flowed in and out of the valley than anyone. There were people who'd been watching Dern's expansion with unease they'd individually written off as uncharitable, and were now, collectively, less sure. Calder didn't ask for anything dramatic. He laid out what he knew and what he suspected, separated carefully so that nobody could mistake opinion for fact. He asked for documentation, anyone who'd had dealings with Dern that hadn't gone quite right, anyone who'd had a horse certified by Vale that had later developed a condition the certification hadn't mentioned, anyone who'd felt pressure around their land or water. 3 of the 6 had something, not enough alone, but pointed in the same direction. He rode back to Lenora's ranch on the morning of the 3rd day as he'd promised, arriving mid-afternoon with the sun already getting low and the cold settling in the way it did in November, the kind of cold that meant business. Lenora was in the barn with Nightwind. She was standing beside the horse, not examining him, not treating him, just standing there with her hand on his neck, and the horse's head turned slightly toward her, and for a moment before she knew Calder was there, The expression on her face was the most unguarded he'd seen it. Then she heard him, and the expression rearranged itself, and she looked toward the barn door with that careful composure. You said 3 days. It's the third day. It's the afternoon of the third day. Harriet Bledsoe takes her time. He came into the barn. How is he? Lenora looked at Nightwind. Better. He wants to move, you can tell. He's been testing the leg himself, putting more weight on it. She looked at Calder. How's Wolf Creek? Building toward something. He told her about the property complaints, about Harriet's parlor meeting, about what the telegraph operator had quietly mentioned about a series of wires between Dern's operation and an address in the territorial capital that nobody could explain. He told her about Aldous going out to look at the boundary markers. Lenora listened, and he watched her face do the thing it did when she was taking in information seriously that focused, slightly inward quality, like she was fitting pieces into a structure she could already see the shape of. He's not just trying to push me out, she said. He's been expanding all along. Poisoning, the fences going down, the offer to buy, it's all the same move. Toward what? My water rights, she said it quietly. My land runs along the best stretch of the creek. If he controls the water this far up, he controls what everyone downstream can do with their grazing. She looked at him. Bram knew this land. He used to say, whoever holds the high water holds the valley. Calder looked at her for a long moment. Bram said that? More than once. And Bram was working Dern's land the week he was hurt. He worked through it quietly. If Bram understood the water rights well enough to say that, and if he was on Dern's land and saw something he shouldn't have, then it wasn't just that Dern didn't want Bram's mouth to run about a sick horse, Lenora said. Her voice was very flat now. It was that Bram understood the land well enough to have put together what Dern was actually trying to do. The barn was quiet. Nightwind moved his head gently against Lenora's shoulder, and she didn't push him away. I found the copies of the notebooks, Calder said. Both of them. I made them the night you left. They're good documentation. Detailed. He paused. The Territorial Marshal's office is sending someone out in 10 days to review the property complaints. That gives us 10 days to build what we have into something a territorial investigation can use. And in 10 days, Dern might do something else. Yes, he didn't see the point in pretending otherwise. He might. She looked at him steadily in the barn's low light, and he understood that she was doing the same calculation he was, the same weighing of what might come against what they had and what they could do about it. She was not a woman who needed reassurance. She was a woman who needed the truth with all its rough edges intact, because she'd been given too many smooth surfaces that turned out to be walls. Nightwind will be ready in another 4 days, she said. I want you to stay until then. He looked at her. 4 days. That's my professional assessment of the horse's recovery. She met his eyes without flinching. Whatever else it is or isn't, it's that first all right, Calder said. 4 days. Nightwind shifted in the stall, his weight moving evenly now, the tendon holding what it was asked to hold, the long healing work finally paying its return. Somewhere out on the property, the gray mare called once to the sorrel in the next pasture, a sound that carried in the cold evening air and faded toward the mountains. 4 days, Calder thought, and whatever came after 4 days. He went to get his gear from the saddlebag and settle the quarter horse back into her stall, and he didn't look back toward where Lenora was standing, because he didn't need to. He could feel exactly where she was without looking, and that was the kind of information a careful man noted and did not speak aloud until the time was right for speaking. The 4 days passed the way days do when you're watching for something too slowly in the quiet hours and too fast when you weren't paying attention. Calder spent them working. That was the only way he knew to manage the particular tension of waiting for a threat to materialize, while having no way to make it show itself on his schedule. He fixed every broken thing on the property he could find. He rode the fence line twice and documented every section that had been interfered with 5 spots total, all of them on the creek side. All of them cut in ways that looked like weather damage until you looked at the cut ends of the wire and saw they were too clean. He helped Lenora with the morning and evening treatments, learned which horses needed to be approached from which side, and which ones responded to a particular low sound she made, something between a hum and a word that wasn't quite either. On the second day, Aldous rode out from Wolf Creek with news about the boundary markers. Every one of the markers he'd examined on the contested properties showed signs of recent movement, fresh earth, ground disturbed in a radius too neat to be animal work. He'd taken measurements against the original land grant coordinates Calder had sent him to retrieve, and in every case the markers had been moved to Dern's advantage by between 12 and 40 feet. 40 feet of creek-adjacent land, multiplied by the length of two properties, was a significant amount of water access. Good work, Calder told him, and meant it. There's something else. Aldous pulled a folded paper from his coat. Territorial Land Registry sent this in response to your wire. Dern filed an amended water rights claim 6 weeks ago. The filing describes boundaries that match where his markers are now, not where they were originally. Calder held the paper and read it twice. He filed the amended claim and then moved the markers to match the claim. Yes, sir, in that order, which means he has paperwork supporting his version. Yes, sir, but the original land grants predate his claim by 20 years, So a territorial judge would need to sort out which documentation is valid. Calder folded the paper. Which takes time, and in that time Dern's claim sits on record, and anyone looking at the surface of it sees documentation in his favor. He handed the paper back. Keep this. Keep a copy of everything. Original documents stay at Harriet Bledsoe's house. Tell her I asked. She'll understand. Aldous nodded and rode back to Wolf Creek, and Calder walked back to the barn with the slow, careful steps of a man assembling a picture that was getting clearer and uglier the more pieces came in. Lenora was inside with the sorrel, running him through groundwork, in the center aisle, teaching the horse to move away from pressure, to understand that pressure wasn't a threat, to build the vocabulary of trust that a badly handled animal had to learn from scratch before it could learn anything else. The sorrel was better, still nervous, still prone to sudden flinching, but better, the kind of better that was real progress rather than just a good day. She looked up when Calder came in. She read his face before he said anything. More, he confirmed. He told her about the land filing, the markers, the timing. She listened with her hands still on the sorrel's lead, keeping the horse calm by keeping herself calm, the way she always did. He's been planning this for a long time, she said when Calder finished. Yes, Bram would have been. She stopped, started again. Bram understood this valley, the water, the land, who owned what and why it mattered. If he'd lived and understood what Dern was doing, he would have been exactly the kind of man who could have stopped it, Calder said. The kind with enough knowledge of the land and enough standing in the community to make people listen. Lenora looked down at the sorrel's lead in her hands. And instead he's dead, and I'm the grieving widow who doesn't know what she's talking about. She said it without self-pity, which was its own kind of grief. Convenient. It's going to stop being convenient very soon, Calder said. The territorial marshal's investigator is coming in 8 days. What we build between now and then determines how much leverage we have. She nodded and went back to the sorrel and said nothing else. But her jaw had that set quality he'd learned to recognize the look of a woman who had decided something and was done debating it internally. That evening, Nightwind walked the fence line of the small paddock outside the barn, at a pace that wasn't quite a trot and wasn't quite a fast walk, and he did it without favoring the leg. Lenora watched from the gate, without speaking for a long time. He's ready, she said finally. Tomorrow. Calder looked at the horse the way Nightwind moved, the evenness of his stride, the ease in his body that had been missing for nearly 3 weeks. You're sure? I told you I'd tell you when he was ready. He's ready. She looked at Calder with an expression he couldn't entirely read. You could go home tonight. Tomorrow, Calder said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Nightwind. Tomorrow, she agreed. It was 3 hours after midnight when the wind picked up. Calder woke to it the way a man wakes, to sounds his sleeping mind has already categorized as wrong, not the normal wind of a Montana night, which he'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks, but something with a different quality. Sharper, carrying something. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before he was fully conscious of having made the decision to move. He smelled it before he saw it. Smoke. The specific, dense smell of burning hay and old wood, the kind of smell that in a barn at 3 in the morning meant something irreversible was already happening. He ran. The barn was on the north side. He could see the light from the moment he cleared the house door, the orange flicker visible through the gaps in the barn siding. Not a small fire, not a lantern knocked over or an ember that had traveled. This was fire that had been set deliberately in multiple places, the way a fire looks when someone has planned for it to be unstoppable. He hit the barn door and threw it open, and the heat came out like a fist. 12 horses inside. He knew that without counting 12 recovering animals in various stages of treatment, some that could move fast and some that couldn't. The sound inside was the specific horror of panicked horses, a sound that bypassed rational thought entirely and struck at something older and more primal. Lenora was already there. She had come from the other door, the side entrance, and she was already at the first stall. She hadn't stopped to think, hadn't assessed the situation from a safe distance she'd come, in the same way Calder had, which was in and moving and dealing with what was directly in front of her. The back stalls first, she said. Her voice was steady in a way that didn't mean she wasn't scared. It meant she was scared and working anyway. The fires coming from the north corner, the back animals have the least time. Calder moved. He had the first stall open in seconds, but the horse inside the bay gelding, the one with the bite, was completely lost in panic, slamming himself against the stall walls, refusing to move toward the door. Open stalls didn't help horses that had shut down into pure terror. Blindfold, Lenora said sharply. She thrust a cloth at him as she passed. Cover his eyes. All of them cover their eyes. He didn't stop to process the instruction. He just did it. Got in close enough to throw the cloth over the gelding's head, held it there despite the horse lunging and nearly taking him off his feet, and the moment the gelding's vision was gone, the animal stilled enough, not calm. Not even close to calm, but still enough to be moved. Lenora had the first 2 horses out before Calder got the bay through the door. She was moving through the smoke with a focused efficiency that had nothing to do with fearlessness and everything to do with a woman who knew exactly what was at stake and had made a decision about it. The smoke was getting bad. Eyes watering, each breath carrying heat and particulate, the kind of smoke that confused direction and swallowed sound. Calder got the bay out, handed him off to nobody there, as nobody dropped the rope, and went back in. They fell into a brutal rhythm. Calder cut stall latches and held horses while Lenora blinded and guided, and between them they moved animal after panicked animal through the burning doorway into the cold night air. Some horses were easier than others. The gray mare, despite her injury, despite everything, went quietly once blinded, as if she'd spent enough time trusting Lenora that the trust held even here. The sorrel took 3 attempts. Calder had burns on his left forearm by the time they got the sorrel out, the sleeve of his shirt having caught a piece of falling ember and been put out by his own hand without him fully registering it. 10 horses out. 11. He was counting as they went because Lenora was counting too, and they both knew what the count meant. The roof at the north end was going. Not just burning going, the structural timbers audible above the roar of the fire, a cracking and settling that any man who'd spent time around buildings understood as a countdown. Calder looked at Lenora at the doorway and held up 2 fingers. 2 more. She held up 1 finger and pointed left. 1 in the left end stall. He'd gotten the other already. She went left. He went after her. The left end stall held the Chestnut Hadley's horse, the one that had been closest to death from the poisoning, the one they'd fought for together 2 weeks ago. The horse had pressed himself into the back corner of the stall, and the smoke in this section was thick enough that Calder was breathing through his sleeve and barely seeing. Lenora was already in with the horse, already getting the cloth over his head, her hands moving with the same precision they moved with in daylight, with adequate air, with time. The horse came. He was big and heavy, and Lenora weighed considerably less than he did. And for a moment, the chestnut resisted in that enormous dumb way of horses who are terrified and don't understand that the human attached to them is trying to move them toward life. Calder got a hand on the lead rope beside Lenora's, and they both pulled, walking backward, and the chestnut lurched forward, and they got him moving, and they moved. They came through the barn door into the cold air, all 3 of them, at exactly the moment the north section of the roof came down. The sound was not what Calder expected. It wasn't dramatic. It was a dense, settling crash that pushed a wave of heat and sparks outward. And the sparks rained down around them, and the horses already outside scattered, and several of Lenora's carefully recovered animals ran into the dark beyond the barn light and were gone. Calder stood in the cold yard and coughed. Lenora was coughing beside him. Chestnut stood between them, still blinded, his sides heaving. The barn burned. Are you burned? Calder's voice came out wrong, rougher than he intended, stripped by smoke. My hands. She was looking at them. The backs of both hands were reddened, and there was a longer burn along her right forearm from wrist to elbow where she'd caught something inside. They're not bad. Are you... left arm? Sleeve. It's nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was a burn that was going to hurt considerably more in an hour than it did now, but it was survivable, and that was the only category that mattered. How many are loose? She was already counting the animals visible in the yard and the pasture beyond. Some had stopped running and stood in groups in the dark, their white breath rising in the cold. Others were further out. 8 here, she said. 4 somewhere in the dark. We'll find them at light. Can you see? He turned and stopped. A man was standing at the edge of the barn light, just inside the reach of it, where the firelight made faces difficult to read but not impossible. He was a heavy-set man with a beard, and he was watching the burning barn with an expression that was trying to be a neutral bystander's expression, and was instead the expression of a man who expected to see something that wasn't there. He was looking for something. In the smoke and the chaos, he was looking for something specific. He hadn't found it. When he saw Calder looking at him, he turned and walked away, fast, not quite running, trying to look like someone who'd heard the commotion and come to see, trying to look like he was leaving instead of retreating. Calder went after him. He was tired and his arm was burning and his lungs were working harder than he'd like. But he was also a man who'd spent 2 decades at various levels of law enforcement, and he understood that a person walking away from a burning barn in the middle of the night, when everyone else was moving toward it, was a person he needed to speak to. He caught up to the man at the gate, got a hand on his shoulder and turned him around. And the man's face resolved in the available light into a face Calder had seen, but not met, a face that appeared in the back of the saloon in Wolf Creek occasionally, and sometimes in conversation near Dern's operation on the north end. Name, Calder said. I heard the fire. I came to see. Name. Redder. Cole Redder. His eyes moved past Calder toward the burning barn. You came from the wrong direction, Cole. The road is east. You came from the north. Calder kept his voice level and his grip on the man's shoulder. There are 12 horses in that barn. There were 12 horses. Someone set that fire in at least 3 places. And you're here, coming from the north, in the middle of the night, looking for something you didn't find. He pulled the man slightly closer. Where's Urquhart? Redder's face shifted. Just for a second, just a small involuntary thing. The flicker of a man who heard a name and couldn't entirely stop himself from reacting to it. I don't know any Urquhart. You're a poor liar for a man in a profession that requires it. Calder walked him backward until he was against the fence post at the gate. Here's what's going to happen, Cole. I'm going to leave you here while I go back and help Mrs. Whitlock with what's left of her barn and her horses. In the morning, you're going to come with me to Wolf Creek, and you're going to sit down with me and my deputy, and you're going to tell me exactly what you were looking for tonight and who asked you to look for it. You can do that voluntarily, or I can arrest you right now on suspicion of arson, and you can do it in a cell. You can't prove, I don't need to prove it tonight. I just need to hold you on suspicion, which I have plenty of. He held Redder's eyes. Or you can talk to me in the morning, and we can discuss whether your employer threw you in front of something that's about to land very badly on everyone involved. Redder looked at him for a long moment. The fire reflected in his eyes, orange and shifting. Morning, he said finally. Calder left him at the gate. He wasn't going anywhere. A man who agrees to morning has already calculated that running is worse, and went back to Lenora. She was gathering the loose horses methodically, moving through the yard and the near pasture with a lamp, her voice that low, steady murmur that the animals responded to, even in extremis. She'd already gotten 2 of the 4 loose ones. Her hands were wrapped now, with cloth she'd gotten from somewhere, rough field dressing, and she moved with the slight, careful quality of someone managing pain without making it the main event. I have a man at the gate, Calder said. He was here when he shouldn't have been. Dern's? Almost certainly. He'll talk in the morning. Calder took the lamp from her so she could use both hands. Let's get the horses. They worked through the rest of the night. The barn was gone, there was no saving it, and neither of them wasted energy trying. What they could save was the animals, and by the time the sky started lightening in the east, they had all 12 accounted for, 11 standing in the south pasture, and one with a minor burn on his hindquarters that Lenora had already treated. The two of them working in the gray pre-dawn with the calm efficiency of people who'd been working together long enough to not need many words. As the light came up, Calder walked the perimeter of what had been the barn. The fire had burned hot and fast, which was consistent with accelerant. Something had been used to make it start big and spread faster than hay and old wood would normally manage. He found 3 points of origin, just as he'd expected, each of them near the base of the walls, each of them showing the characteristic burn pattern of a fire that hadn't started from inside and moved out, but from outside and moved in. He found something else. In the northeast corner, where the burn had been hottest and the floor had collapsed entirely, there was a section of the floor that hadn't burned through. A single section of heavy planking, partially buried under collapsed roofing material, that had been sheltered enough by a falling beam to survive mostly intact. And when Calder moved the debris with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was looking at might matter, he found what the arsonists had been looking for and hadn't been able to get to. The space beneath the planking, a dry storage area, low and narrow. Inside it, a tin box, latched but not locked, and inside the box, protected by the metal and by the luck of the fallen beam above it, a leather-bound ledger with water-stained covers and small tight handwriting on pages that were singed at the edges but intact. He sat back on his heels in the rubble of the burned barn and opened the ledger. The handwriting was Vale's. He recognized it from the medical certificates he'd pulled from the territorial records in Wolf Creek, the same cramped, precise hand. The ledger went back 7 years, and what it contained was not the ordinary record of a country veterinarian's practice. It was a record of every horse Vale had certified as healthy without examining. Every false diagnosis. Every payment received from Dern for services that amounted to fraud. The entries were coded not well coded the way a man codes things when he wants to be able to read them himself, without quite putting the incriminating words directly on the page, but coded thinly enough that Calder read it without difficulty. 3 pages in, he found an entry dated 4 years ago that stopped him cold. The date was 6 days before Bram Whitlock died. The entry referenced a bull at Dern's operation, a bull showing symptoms consistent with a contagious respiratory infection, the kind that moved through a herd fast and could be devastating to a breeding operation's value if disclosed. Vale had noted the symptoms, noted his assessment, and noted his decision. Not to be disclosed, BW exposure risk noted, situation to be managed. BW Bram Whitlock. Bram had been on Dern's property that week. He'd told Lenora about the sick bull. He'd mentioned it to Dern. And Vale had written it down, had noted that Bram was a risk, that the situation needed to be managed 6 days before Bram died of an infection that Vale had refused to treat. Calder sat in the ruins of Lenora's barn with the ledger in his hands and understood that what he was holding was not just evidence of fraud. It was evidence of something considerably darker. A man who had decided that a witness to his corruption was a problem to be managed, and who had then managed it by withholding treatment from that witness when the opportunity presented itself. Closed the ledger. Behind him he heard Lenora's footsteps in the debris. She came and crouched beside him, and he handed her the ledger without a word, and she opened it, and he watched her face as she read. She didn't cry. He had learned by now that Lenora Whitlock wasn't a woman who cried easily. Not because she felt things less than other people, but because she'd spent 3 years making sure that her grief and her anger never became the thing people pointed to when they wanted to dismiss what she knew. She'd held herself together so long it had become structural. But her hands shook, just slightly, just the small involuntary tremor of someone whose body is registering something that the rest of them is still working to contain. He knew, she said. Her voice was barely above the sound of the morning wind. 6 days before Bram died, he knew Bram had seen the bull and he wrote it down. Yes, she turned the pages, found the entries for the weeks after Bram's death, Vale's notations of his visits, his recorded assessments. every one of them flagrantly inconsistent with what Lenora had described and what any honest physician would have written about the progression of symptoms she'd been documenting. He let him die, she said. Calder didn't offer her a more palatable version of it. She deserved better than comfort built from imprecision. The evidence suggests he made a calculated decision not to treat an infection he recognized, because treating it would have required acknowledging Bram's presence on Dern's land during the period the bull was sick. He paused. I believe a territorial prosecutor will read it the same way. She closed the ledger. She held it with both wrapped hands against her chest for a moment, and he watched the shaking slowly stop as she brought the same discipline to bear on her body that she brought to everything else. He hid it here, she said. Under his own barn floor, Calder said. He must have had a reason to believe it was safer here than at his office. Maybe he thought it was a record he might need someday for his own protection proof of what he'd done for Dern, in case Dern ever needed to be held accountable. Men like Vale always think they'll need leverage eventually. She looked at the burned walls around them, the open sky where the roof had been, the morning light coming through where the boards had fallen. Dern's men burned my barn to get to this. Yes. Which means Dern knew it was here. Which means Vale told him. Calder stood, careful of the debris around him. Which means whatever protection Vale thought this ledger gave him, he traded it away. Lenora stood too. She looked at the destroyed barn at the pasture where 12 horses stood in the early light, alive and mostly sound, the evidence of two people's night work visible in their continued breathing. She looked at the hollow space where the floorboard had been. She looked at the ledger in her hands. What do I do with this? She asked. You hold on to it, Calder said, tightly, and I go deal with Cole Redder at the gate before he makes a poor decision about his morning. He turned to go, and Lenora said his name. He stopped. She stood in the ruins of the barn she'd built her recovery work in, holding the ledger that contained the truth about her husband's death, her hands wrapped in cloth, the burns on her forearm already coloring past red toward something worse. In the early light, with everything burned and everything wrong, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had just survived something that was supposed to destroy her and was already working out what came next. He had the bull treated after Bram died, she said. I remember thinking about a month after the funeral. I heard the Dern herd had been quarantined briefly and released. I thought at the time it was strange, that Vale would act quickly on the bull but not on Bram. She looked at Calder. I didn't understand why then. Because the bull was still valuable, Calder said quietly. And Bram's inconvenience had already been resolved. The words were brutal. He knew they were brutal. But Lenora had asked him weeks ago for the truth with its rough edges, and he had promised her, without saying it directly, that he would always give her that. She nodded once, pressed the ledger slightly closer. Go deal with Redder, she said. And Calder, he waited. Come back after. It wasn't a large thing. 3 words or 5, depending on how you counted. But coming from Lenora Whitlock, in the ruins of her barn, the morning after the worst night her property had seen since she'd built it, they landed in Calder Rains like something that had been looking for a place to land for a very long time. I will, he said. He went to deal with Redder, and the morning opened up around the destroyed barn, and the 12 horses stood in the south pasture, eating the hay Lenora had thrown them before first light. Because that was who Lenora Whitlock was, a woman who fed the horses first and dealt with everything else after, even when everything else was considerable. Redder talked. He didn't talk easily, and he didn't talk completely, and some of what he said was shaped more by what he thought Calder already knew than by any particular commitment to honesty. But he talked enough. He confirmed that Urquhart had organized the barn fire. He confirmed that Urquhart worked directly for Dern. He confirmed that the target of the fire had been something hidden in the barn, he didn't know what. Just that Dern had told Urquhart it needed to be destroyed, and Urquhart had passed that instruction down. He also, under sustained and careful questioning, confirmed that the creek poisoning 6 weeks earlier had been Urquhart's work, too. He'd helped carry the material up to the tributary. He hadn't known what it was, he said. Calder believed about half of that. By mid-morning, Aldous had ridden out from Wolf Creek and taken Redder back with him, under Calder's written instruction to hold him and not let anyone speak to him until the territorial investigator arrived. The instructions specifically named Urquhart, Dern, and any attorney associated with Dern's operation. And by mid-morning, something else had happened that Calder hadn't anticipated. People were arriving at the ranch. Not a crowd, not all at once, but in ones and twos throughout the morning hours. As word traveled the way, word traveled in a valley where people were up before dawn, and news moved on horseback faster than on foot. Hadley came first. He came and saw the burned barn and saw the chestnut standing in the south pasture, alive and eating, and he took his hat off and held it in both hands and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need?" Lenora looked at him. "What lumber? Hay. Whatever you need. What do you need first?" She stared at him for a moment with the expression of a woman who has prepared herself carefully for something and finds that the preparation was for the wrong thing. Hadley. The man who took my horse in when she was poisoning and stayed up all night with her doesn't get told nothing when her barn burns down. His voice was rough, the way old men's voices get when they're saying something they should have said sooner. "I heard there were people here last night who shouldn't have been. I heard it was deliberate. There's evidence suggesting that, yes. Then you tell me what you need and I'll get it." Peterson came an hour later. Cord came. 2 families from the north end, the ones whose boundary markers had been moved, came and saw the burned barn and put their hands to work clearing debris without being asked. The telegraph operator from Wolf Creek appeared mid-afternoon with a written message from Harriet Bledsoe that read, in its entirety, "Tell me what you need and consider it done. H.B." Lenora moved through all of it with a composure that cost her something. Calder could see that. It was not easy to accept help from people who had doubted her, and she was not a woman who found grace in being pitied. But she was also not a woman who let pride be more important than what the horses needed, and what the horses needed was a barn, and a barn required more than 2 pairs of hands. By late afternoon, the debris was cleared and the outline of a new foundation was being planned, and Lenora was sitting on the fence of the south pasture, watching 12 horses eat in the low winter sunlight. Calder came and stood beside her. "How are your hands?" he asked. "They'll be fine." She looked at them briefly, then back at the horses. "How's your arm?" "It'll be fine." He looked at the horses too. The sorrel was standing near the gate, close to where Lenora sat, the way horses sometimes position themselves near the person they've decided to trust. Redder talked. "I know. Aldous told me before he left." She was quiet for a moment. "Urquhart. We'll find Urquhart. He's not clever enough to have made himself hard to find, and he's not connected enough that Dern will protect him when it becomes costly to do so." Dern. The ledger gives us Dern. Not just the fraud, the whole picture. Territorial prosecutor is going to read those entries and see what Vale decided about Bram, and that connects directly to Dern's operation. He paused. "It won't be fast. These things never are. But it will happen." She was quiet for a while. The sun was going down behind the mountains, painting the pasture gold, and the 12 horses stood in it like they belonged there, which they did. "Hadley asked me what I need," she said. "I heard." I didn't know what to say. She looked at her wrapped hands. "For 3 years I've been out here thinking that what I needed was for people to leave me alone, to stop looking at me like I was something broken they felt bad about. And now," she shook her head slightly, "I don't know how to want something from people who hurt you. I don't know how to let that be all right." "You don't have to decide that today," Calder said. "No." She looked at the horses for a long time. "But I think I'm going to have to decide it eventually." The last of the daylight was leaving the pasture, and the people who had come to help were wrapping up their work for the day. And somewhere in Wolf Creek, a man named Redder was sitting in a cell, deciding how much more he was willing to say. And in that tin box inside Calder's coat was a ledger that contained the truth about what had happened to Bram Whitlock, and to this valley, and to a woman who had known the truth for 3 years and been told she was wrong about it. The sorrel put his nose over the fence rail and breathed near Lenora's shoulder, warm breath in the cold air. She reached up and put her wrapped hand against his nose and left it there. The territorial investigator arrived on a Tuesday, which Calder noted because Tuesdays had always struck him as the most honest day of the week. Nothing glamorous about a Tuesday, nothing that encouraged pretense. His name was Holt Ferris, and he came from the territorial marshal's office in Helena with a leather satchel, a methodical mind, and the particular brand of patience that distinguished good investigators from merely adequate ones. He was 50-something, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that gave nothing away by habit, rather than by effort. He read people the way Calder read land, by looking at what had been disturbed rather than what sat still on the surface. Ferris arrived at the ranch first, which Calder had arranged deliberately. He wanted Ferris to see the burned barn before he saw anything else. He wanted the investigator to stand in the debris and understand the sequence, not be told it, not read it in a report, but stand in it with the ash still on the ground and the new foundation posts just going in and 12 horses in the south pasture that were alive because 2 people had made a decision in the middle of the night to go back in. Lenora met Ferris at the gate. She was wearing her work clothes, which she always wore, and her hands were still partially wrapped, the burns healing but not healed. She shook Ferris's hand with the unwrapped one and led him through what was left of the barn without preamble. Ferris walked the site slowly. He crouched at 2 of the 3 origin points Calder had marked. He took out a small notebook and wrote in it. He looked at the northeast corner where the floorboard had been, and at the hollow space beneath, and at the tin box sitting beside it. He didn't touch anything Calder hadn't told him he could touch. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, when he'd seen enough to be asking questions. "The ledger was found here, under this board?" "Under that board, yes," Lenora said. "Calder found it the morning after the fire. And Vale's presence on this property, you're certain of it? That he stored this here rather than at his own office?" The ledger references this property twice. Calder had read it thoroughly enough by now that he could quote it from memory. 2 entries referencing inspections conducted at the Whitlock Ranch inspections. Vale apparently did conduct here, early in the operation, when he needed to establish a professional relationship with the property. My read is that he knew, if something ever went wrong, the last place anyone would think to look for his private records was the ranch of the woman he'd discredited. Ferris looked at Calder for a long moment. "That's a sophisticated read." "It's the only one that fits," Calder said. "A man keeping records like this doesn't keep them where they can be easily found and connected to him. He keeps them somewhere that requires a search he thinks nobody will ever conduct." And Dern knew the ledger was here. Redder confirmed that Dern directed Urquhart to retrieve something from this property. He didn't know what, specifically, but he knew the location. The barn, northeast corner, under the floor. Calder paused. "Which means Vale told Dern where it was. Whether that was voluntary or under pressure, I can't say." Ferris made another note. "Where is Dr. Vale currently?" "Still in Wolf Creek," Calder said. "He hasn't left, which surprised me at first. But a man who's been careful for 20 years doesn't run the moment things get complicated running, is itself an admission. He's still seeing patients, still acting as though everything is ordinary. And Dern? At his ranch. His men are quiet. Urquhart has not been located, yet Aldous has 3 men looking, and I have a description circulating through the territorial network." Calder looked at Ferris steadily. "I want to be clear about what I believe the ledger shows before you read it yourself. The fraud is extensive and documented, but there's a specific entry I need you to look at before anything else, an entry dated 6 days before Bram Whitlock's death, referencing Dern's sick bull and Bram's exposure to that information. You think it speaks to Whitlock's death. I think it speaks to the decision not to treat Whitlock's infection. I think a prosecutor who reads that entry and then reads Vale's recorded visit notes from Bram's final illness will see what I see." He held Ferris's gaze. "Vale wrote down the risk. Then he managed the risk by withdrawing the one thing that could have saved the man who represented it." Ferris was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Lenora, who had been standing through this exchange with that particular quality she had not passive, not removed, but present in a way that didn't require performance. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "you've had this theory for 3 years." "I've had the knowledge for 3 years," she said. "The theory was always just the knowledge looking for the right language." Ferris held her gaze for a moment, reading her the way he read everything carefully, without rushing to conclusion. Then he looked at his notebook. "I'll need to read the ledger tonight. I'll want statements from you and from Deputy Raines tomorrow morning. And I'll need to speak with Redder. Redder is in Wolf Creek. My deputy has him." Calder looked at the burned barn, the new posts going in, Hadley's hired man working alongside the feed merchant's boy to frame the new walls. I'd also suggest speaking with Harriet Bledsoe. She's been in this valley 30 years and her memory is exact. Harriet Bledsoe. Ferris wrote the name. Anyone else? Calder thought of the 6 people in Harriet's parlor, the ranchers, with unexplained losses, the telegraph operator with records of wires that shouldn't exist, the feed merchant who'd sold unusual quantities of certain materials to Dern's operation in the months before the creek poisoning. Several others, he said. I'll make you a list. Ferris read the ledger that night, alone, at the kitchen table, while Calder and Lenora sat in the other room and did not speak much. There was not a great deal to say that hadn't already been said, and there was something in the particular quality of waiting, knowing that a stranger in the next room was reading the document that contained the truth about the worst thing that had happened to the person sitting across from you. That made ordinary conversation feel beside the point. Lenora sat with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and looked at the fire. Calder sat with one that was at least getting warmer attention. He's going to find what you found, she said, at some point in the middle of the waiting. Yes, and then what? And then it moves from what I believe to what can be formally alleged. And then it moves from what can be formally alleged to what can be proven in front of a judge. He set his cup down. Slow. I won't tell you it isn't. Dern has money and money buys time in any legal proceeding. Vale has standing or had it, and standing counts for something even when it shouldn't. But the ledger is in Vale's own handwriting. The entry about Bram is in Vale's own handwriting. And Retter's statement names Urquhart, and Urquhart works for Dern, and the chain of instruction runs directly from the arson back to the man who ordered it. He looked at her steadily. It's not perfect, it never is, but it's enough. She looked at the fire for a while. I used to think about what I'd feel, she said, when something like this happened. When something changed. I thought I'd feel I don't know. More. Something larger than this. What do you feel? She considered it honestly, the way she considered most things. Tired, she said, and something underneath the tired that I don't have a word for yet. Not happy. Not satisfied. She looked at her wrapped hands. Maybe it'll come later. It usually does, Calder said. The big feelings almost always run late. From the kitchen, the sound of pages turning. The next 3 weeks moved with the grinding, non-linear pace of formal legal proceedings, which was to say they moved slowly when Calder wanted speed, and with sudden lurching momentum at the moments when he least expected it. Ferris spent 4 days in the valley, conducting interviews with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood that a case built on documentation was only as strong as the documentation you could verify independently. He spoke to Harriet. He spoke to the 2 families with the moved boundary markers. He spoke to the telegraph operator, who produced records of wires between Dern's operation and a land company in the territorial capital that had been quietly purchasing options on property adjacent to the creek for 18 months. He spoke to Vale. Calder wasn't present for that conversation. Ferris conducted it alone, which was standard procedure, and which Calder respected even though the restriction cost him something. Aldous told him afterward that Vale had emerged from the conversation with Ferris, looking the way a man looks when he realizes the structure he's been living inside has developed more cracks than he knew. Vale did not confess. He wasn't the kind of man who confessed. He was the kind of man who calculated, and what he calculated, apparently, was that Ferris's questions were specific enough and the documentation extensive enough that the calculation had changed. The leverage Vale thought he'd had the ledger, as his insurance was now in someone else's hands, and what it insured against was now the least of his problems. On the 5th day after Ferris's arrival, Vale left Wolf Creek. He left quietly, early in the morning, with a single bag and his horse. The woman who ran the boarding house he'd stayed in for a decade said he'd paid his bill the night before and hadn't said where he was going. He left a note for his 2 remaining regular patients, apologizing for any inconvenience. He didn't get far. Ferris had been less certain than Calder that Vale would stay, and had quietly arranged for someone to watch the road out of the valley. Vale was stopped 12 miles east, still within territorial jurisdiction, by a deputy from the next county who had received Ferris's description and instructions the day before. He was brought back to Wolf Creek. He was not put in a cell immediately. Ferris was careful about the sequence of things, about doing everything in the order that would make it hold, but he was formally informed that he was the subject of a territorial investigation and that leaving the territory would be treated as an admission relevant to the proceedings. Vale sat with that for 2 days. On the second day, he asked to speak to Ferris alone. What happened in that conversation remained formally confidential. What Calder was able to learn through the particular unofficial channels that exist in any territory small enough that everyone knows in everyone else's business was that Vale spoke for 4 hours and covered, among other things, the specific arrangement between himself and Dern, the financial terms of it, the scope of the fraudulent certifications, and the entry in the ledger about Bram Whitlock. What Vale said about Bram, Calder learned not from Ferris and not from Aldous, but from Lenora, who was told directly by Ferris as a courtesy that Calder had specifically requested on her behalf. She came to find him afterward in the South Pasture, where he was working with Nightwind, the first real writing work they'd done together since the injury. Easy circles, nothing demanding, just re-establishing the partnership. She stood at the fence and waited until he brought Nightwind to the gate. Her face told him before she spoke. He admitted it, she said. Not in those words. Ferris said he used different language. He said he had assessed that treating the infection aggressively would create a complicated situation. Her voice was careful, the way it got when she was managing something precisely. He said he had judged that the complication was not worth the treatment. Calder looked at her for a moment. He said that, more or less. Ferris said the exact phrasing was the clinical calculus did not support intervention at that time. She held Calder's gaze. Clinical calculus. Bram was a clinical calculus. There was nothing adequate to say to that, so Calder didn't try to say anything adequate. He got down from Nightwind and led the horse through the gate and stood with Lenora in the cold afternoon. And after a moment, she put one hand against the fence rail and pressed it there, not for support, just for something solid. Does it help? Calder asked, knowing that he said it. She thought about it honestly. It helps that it's true now in a way other people can see. True. But now it's documented, official. She took a breath. He can't talk his way around it anymore. He can't make me sound hysterical for knowing what I knew. Because what I knew is sitting in a record somewhere with his name on it. Yes, Calder said. That's exactly what it is. She stood quietly for a moment. I thought I'd feel angrier, she said. I've been angry for 3 years. I expected more of it. What do you feel instead? She looked at the pasture. At the 12 horses in it, all of them alive, most of them further along in their recovery than they'd been 3 weeks ago, despite everything that had happened. The sorrel was near the water trough, moving easily, no trace of the terror that had lived in his body when he'd first come to her. I feel like I can breathe in a way I haven't been able to breathe in a long time, she said. Nightwind pushed his nose against Lenora's shoulder, which he did sometimes now without prompting. She put her hand on his face without looking, automatic, the gesture of someone who has learned the geography of another creature's need. There's going to be a formal proceeding, Calder said. Probably in spring when the territorial court comes through. You'll need to give testimony. I know. It will be difficult. Vale's representation will try to make it about your credibility. They'll bring up the things that were said after Bram died. They'll try to establish that your assessments of his illness were the emotional reactions of a grieving woman who didn't know what she was talking about. She said it without heat. I know. I've had 3 years to think about what that argument looks like. She looked at him. But they'll be making that argument while Vale's own ledger sits in evidence, in his own handwriting, with the entry about Bram. That's a different argument to make than the one they made 3 years ago. Yes, Calder said. It is. Urquhart was found on the second Friday after Ferris's arrival in a town 40 miles west where he'd apparently decided that 40 miles was a safe distance. It was not. Aldous had done the work Calder had asked him to do, which was to quietly circulate Urquhart's description through the network of deputies and sheriffs in the surrounding territory. And a sheriff's deputy had recognized him at a feed store and held him on Aldous's authority. Urquhart was less composed than Redder had been. Redder had calculated carefully before speaking. Urquhart's calculus was simpler and faster. He understood within the first 20 minutes of a Ferris questioning that Redder had already spoken. And a man who knows he's second to talk understands that the first speaker has already shaped the framework he's being inserted into. He confirmed everything Redder had said in added detail. He confirmed that Dern had directed the barn fire specifically to retrieve or destroy something hidden on the property. He confirmed the creek poisoning in detail, the material used, where it had been obtained, the timing that had been chosen to maximize the damage to the horses without making it look immediately deliberate. He confirmed several previous acts of interference the fences, 2 incidents of feed contamination that Lenora had attributed to spoilage rather than sabotage, a missing tool from her equipment shed that had cost her a week of work. And he confirmed, without being asked, and in a way that surprised even Ferris, that Dern had known about Vale's decision regarding Bram Whitlock. Had known at the time, had in fact been the one to make the suggestion. Not in those words. Urquhart said it, the way someone says a thing they understand is damning without quite understanding why. Dern said Vale needed to let the Whitlock thing settle on its own. Said treating it aggressive would kick up questions they didn't need. Letting it settle on its own. Calder heard this from Ferris and sat with it for a long time. Dern had not administered the untreated infection. Dern had not stood over Bram Whitlock and made a decision to withdraw care. That had been Vale's action, Vale's choice, Vale's hand on the instrument of it. But Dern had known, and Dern had framed it, and Dern's framing let it settle, had given Vale the language to make a monstrous calculation sound like professional judgment. He told Lenora that evening. He didn't consider not telling her, because he'd made a decision early on that she got the truth, and he wasn't going to start making exceptions now. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Dern said, "Let it settle," she repeated. "Yes, that was my husband." "Yes." She looked at nothing for a moment, then looked at Calder. "Will that be enough? Urquhart's word against Dern's?" Urquhart's word, the ledger, the pattern of fraud, the water rights scheme, the physical evidence of the arson, none of it alone is enough. Together it builds a picture that a jury will be able to see. He paused. Dern will spend money on lawyers. He already is, Ferris told me. 2 attorneys have made contact with the territorial office on Dern's behalf. Money buys time, and sometimes it buys outcomes. I won't pretend otherwise. But the ledger doesn't negotiate. Vale's handwriting doesn't negotiate. The entry about Bram doesn't say what a good lawyer wants it to say, and there's no version of that entry that can be reframed into something innocent. He looked at her steadily. Dern may not face the same charges Vale faces regarding Bram. The connection is real, but the legal case is built on implication and Urquhart's testimony, which a defense attorney will attack. But the fraud, the certifications, the water rights, the arson, those will hold. Lenora absorbed this. Bram might not get full justice. The answer to that, Calder said carefully, is that I don't know yet. And I'd rather tell you I don't know than tell you something that sounds better and turns out to be wrong. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression settled. Not acceptance exactly, or not only acceptance. Something that looked more like recognition. Like the expression of a person who has been told hard truths so many times by people who hoped she wouldn't notice the hard parts, that being told the hard part directly felt, somehow, like respect. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. On a Wednesday in the 3rd week, while the proceedings were building toward whatever formal shape they would eventually take, and while the new barn was going up in sections as people came and helped, and the days got colder, and the work continued anyway, 3 women arrived at the ranch. Calder saw them from the paddock where he was working night wind, 3 women on horses, well-dressed for the territory. The kind of women who were ranchers' wives or ranchers themselves, the kind who had calluses but kept their coats clean. He didn't recognize any of them. He watched them pull up to the gate and watched Lenora come out of the partially built barn, wiping her hands, looking at the 3 visitors with the careful expression she used for anything unexpected. Stayed where he was. This wasn't his conversation to insert himself into. The exchange lasted a while. He couldn't hear it from the paddock. But he could see the body language. And what the body language told him was complex and not entirely comfortable. The 3 women arriving with something they were finding difficult to deliver, Lenora receiving it without warmth but without coldness, the conversation going through several phases before something in the group's posture changed, became less formal, less managed, more like people talking instead of people performing the act of talking. When the three women left, Lenora came to the paddock fence and stood there for a moment without speaking. Calder finished the circle he was on and brought Nightwind over. Who were they? He asked. Dunleavy, Marsh, and Cutter. She looked at the road where they'd ridden. Their husbands were among the ones who repeated what Vale said. Bram died. They were the ones who said I was unstable. That I'd been making up my husband's symptoms because I couldn't accept that medicine had limits. She paused. Their wives came to apologize. Calder waited. They also came to ask, she said, whether I would consider treating their horses. Dunleavy has a mare that's been off her feed for 6 weeks, and 3 other veterinarians have given him 3 different diagnoses. Marsh has a foal with a leg that didn't form right, and the recommendation has been to destroy it. She turned to look at Calder. They wanted to know if I'd look. What did you say? She was quiet for a moment. I said I'd look at the mare. She stopped, started again. I said if Marsh's foal had any chance at all, it would depend on what the deformity actually is, and that I wouldn't know that until I saw it, and that anyone who told him to destroy a foal without trying first wasn't thinking about the foal. That sounds like a yes. That sounds like what I'd say to anyone who asked. Her voice was even, but something beneath the evenness was less so, something that was still working through the experience of being apologized to and asked for something in the same breath by people who'd caused harm without quite meaning to. I don't know how to just forgive it. I know that's probably the better way to be. But I don't know how to get there from where I am. You don't have to get there today, Calder said. You looked at the foal, didn't you? You said yes because the foal didn't do anything to you. She looked at him. Yes, that's enough for today. He got down from Nightwind. Everything else can come later. She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually let herself look at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything that needed saying right then. Nightwind put his nose between them. Lenora laughed short, unexpected, slightly rough, the laugh of someone who'd forgotten for a moment that laughing was available. He does that, she said. He's been doing it for 2 weeks, Calder said. I think he considers himself essential to negotiations. She put her hand on Nightwind's face, and the horse leaned into it the way he'd been leaning into her hands since the first night in the storm, 3 weeks ago, which felt now like a different era entirely. The proceeding before the territorial judge took place on the first Tuesday of December, which felt fitting to Calder, another honest day, stripped of glamour, just the work of the thing. It was not in itself the trial. The formal trial would come in spring. What December held was the preliminary hearing, the formal presentation of evidence to the territorial judge to determine whether the case warranted the full weight of prosecution, whether Silas Dern and Orson Vale would be held to answer for what the evidence against them described. Calder testified. He was precise and specific, the way he'd learned to be in 20 years of legal proceedings facts in the order they could be verified, distinctions between what he knew and what he inferred, no embellishment and no softening. The ledger was entered into evidence. Retter's statement was entered. Urquette's statement was entered. Then Lenora testified. She sat in the chair set before the territorial judge, a man named Rourke, who had the patient, slightly tired quality of someone who had spent 30 years sorting out what was true from what people wanted to be true, and she answered every question with the same precision she brought to everything else. She described Bram's illness. She described her conversations with Vale. She described what she'd seen, what she'd said, what she'd been told in response. When the defense's attorney asked whether she had any formal medical training, she said no. When the attorney asked whether she understood that her assessments of her husband's condition might have been colored by her emotional state, she said, "My assessment of my husband's condition was that he had a progressive infection in his forearm that was moving toward his lymphatic system and would kill him if untreated. Dr. Vale's own ledger contains an entry 6 days before my husband's death, acknowledging an exposure risk that required management. My husband died of an untreated infection 4 days after that entry. I'll leave the court to assess which of us had an accurate understanding of what was happening." The attorney tried a second approach. Judge Rourke stopped him. "Counsel," Rourke said, with the tone of a man addressing a situation he finds only slightly interesting, The witness has answered the question with specific reference to documented evidence. If you have a question about the evidence, ask it. If you're asking her to doubt herself, I'd suggest finding a more productive use of this court's time. The attorney moved on. After, in the cold outside the courthouse, Calder stood with Lenora while the territorial business wrapped up inside, and the handful of spectators who'd come. Harriet was there, and Hadley, and the 3 families from the North End, and the telegraph operator filed out around them. Lenora was looking at the mountains. Rourke stopped him, she said. Yes, I didn't expect that. Rourke is a man who reads evidence, Calder said. He read the ledger last night. I know because Ferris told me he sat with it for 2 hours. He believed me. The ledger believed you, Calder said. Rourke just followed the ledger. She was quiet for a while. Cold was real now, winter proper, not the shoulder of it. Her breath made small clouds, and her coat was good wool, practical, no concession to appearance, though she'd have looked well in something finer, and they both knew it without discussing it. Rourke's ruling came out 20 minutes later, relayed by Ferris. Both Vale and Dern were to be held to answer at the spring term of the territorial court. Dern's attorneys had immediately filed for a delay, which was expected. Vale had no attorneys present, which meant he'd either run out of money for them or made a different calculation about the proceedings. Urquhart was charged separately and would be dealt with in a county court, which meant his proceeding would happen faster and with less formal weight, which also meant it would be finished. Probably before the main trial, and Urquhart's outcome would be visible to any jury evaluating Dern. Calder found Lenora again outside and told her Rourke's ruling. She stood in the cold street of Wolf Creek, the town that had watched Vale discredit her, the town where people had looked at her sideways for 3 years, and she let out a breath that had more in it than air. Spring, she said. Spring. Dern will delay as long as he can. He will. But the water rights claim has already been suspended pending the investigation, which means the 2 families on the North End get their land back in practice while the legal question is resolved. The fraudulent certifications have been flagged with the Territorial Livestock Board, which means every horse Dern has sold with a Vale certificate is now subject to review. Calder looked at her. He's not ruined yet, but his operation is on a foundation that's not going to hold. Harriet appeared at Lenora's elbow, which she did with the efficiency of a woman who arrived exactly when she intended to. Come to dinner, she said. Both of you. I'm not asking. Lenora looked at her. 3 years ago, Harriet had been among the people who'd repeated what Vale said. It was there between them, unspoken, and Harriet didn't try to talk around it. I said what I should not have said, Harriet said. I was wrong. I have said so to you privately, and I am saying it here where people can hear it. What you do with that is your business. She looked at Lenora steadily. But you're coming to dinner. Lenora looked at the old woman for a long moment. Then she said, Is it going to be something edible, or is this another situation with that horrible mutton? Harriet's expression shifted into something that was approximately a smile. Beef, I learned my lesson. Then yes, Lenora said. Come to dinner. They walked through Wolf Creek together in the December cold, the 3 of them, and the people they passed looked at Lenora differently than they'd looked at her for 3 years, some of them still uncertain. Some of them with the slightly averted quality of people who know they have something to be ashamed of and haven't yet decided how to carry it, and some of them with something more direct, more present, the look of people choosing to see clearly now that the conditions for it existed. Lenora didn't smile at any of them. She walked with her shoulders level, and her face quiet and her hands in her coat pockets, and she let them look, and she gave them nothing extra. But she walked, through the middle of the town, without apology and without armor beyond the ordinary dignity she'd always carried. Calder walked beside her and did not take her hand, because that wasn't his to do yet, and both of them knew it. But he walked close enough that their arms occasionally touched, in the way of people who have spent 3 weeks in close work together and have long since stopped noticing the proximity, except as a kind of comfort that neither of them has named. At Harriet's door, Lenora stopped for a moment. Calder, she said. Yes. She looked at him. The lamp from Harriet's window fell across her face, making that impossible eye color easier to read, somehow more green than hazel in this light, or more hazel than green. He could never settle it. When Nightwind is ready to go back to work full-time, she said slowly. When there's no reason for you to be staying at the ranch. I've been thinking about that too, he said. I know you have. She held his gaze. I'm not going to make it easy for you. I know that. I'm not, she stopped. Try it again. I'm not the same as I was before Bram. I don't know how much of who I was before is still there. I know who you are, Calder said. I've been watching you work for 3 weeks. I know who you are. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Don't make promises tonight. No promises tonight, he agreed. She held his gaze one more second. Then she turned and went inside, and the warm light of Harriet's house came out around her, and Calder stood on the step for a moment in the cold before following. Through the window he could see Hadley already there, and the Dunleavy family, and 2 of the ranchers from Harriet's parlor meeting, and the telegraph operator telling a story that was making someone laugh. The ordinary assembly of people who live in the same place and have decided for this evening to sit together. He went inside. The door closed behind him, and the cold stayed outside where it belonged. Winter settled over the valley the way it always did, not all at once, but incrementally, each morning a little harder than the last. The ground firming up overnight, and the water troughs needing breaking by 7 if you wanted the horses to drink before noon. Calder stayed. He hadn't made a formal announcement about it. He hadn't renegotiated anything with Aldous or restructured his duties in any way that required a conversation he wasn't ready to have. He simply found, each morning, that there was work at the ranch that needed doing, and that doing it was where he wanted to be. And that Aldous, who was 24 years old and more capable than he'd initially assessed, was managing Wolf Creek with the particular conscientious anxiety of someone who knew they were being trusted and didn't want to waste it. Lenora didn't comment on his continued presence. She also didn't give him any reason to reconsider it, which was its own kind of statement in her particular language. They worked through December in the way they'd established over the weeks before, close, practical, comfortable, in a way that had developed so gradually neither of them had been aware of it happening until it was simply the condition of the place. He knew her rhythms now. She knew his. They didn't narrate this to each other. It existed in the small mechanics of how they moved around the same spaces. Who started the fire in the morning? Who went to the barn first? Who took which side of a difficult horse without needing to discuss it? The new barn went up in stages. Hadley's men came twice a week. The feed merchant donated lumber. Peterson, who had said the worst things after Bram's death, and seemed to understand that the path back from that required sustained usefulness rather than a single apology, showed up every Saturday without being asked and worked until dark. Lenora accepted this with the pragmatism of someone who understood that a barn required wood, regardless of the hands that brought it. What she was less pragmatic about was the marsh foal. She'd gone to see it the week after the preliminary, hearing a foal 4 months old, with a left foreleg that had developed a rotational deformity, turned outward at the knee in a way that made his movement compensatory and his long-term soundness, in the estimation of the 3 veterinarians who'd seen him, essentially 0. The recommendation in each case had been humane destruction. Lenora had looked at the foal for a long time without speaking, crouching in the stall, with her hands moving over the leg, testing the range of motion, watching what the foal did when she applied gentle pressure from different angles. Then she'd said, "He's compensating wrong, which is making the deformity look worse than it is. The rotation isn't fixed, there's movement in it. That means it can be worked." Marsh had looked at her with the expression of a man who wants very badly to believe something and has been told too many times that wanting isn't enough. The others said, "I know what the others said." She'd stood up. "I'm not the others." She'd said it without arrogance, just the flat statement of a woman who'd stopped pretending that the opinion of people who were wrong was worth deferring to out of politeness. "I can't promise you a horse that runs races. I can promise you that I'm going to try before anyone decides trying is finished." She'd brought the foal back to the ranch that afternoon. Calder had helped her unload him, and watched her begin the assessment process, the careful documentation she did with every new animal, the written record that started on the day of arrival and didn't stop until the animal left. She wrote down everything: the angle of deviation, the foal's weight distribution, his reaction to touch at the joint, the temperature of the tissue around the deformity, what he did when she asked him to stand square. "You're going to fix that leg," Calder said. It wasn't a question exactly. "I'm going to try to fix that leg," she said. "There's a difference, and it matters." She looked up from her notes. "I won't know for 3 months whether I'm right about the rotation having mobility. If I'm wrong, we'll be back to the same conversation the others were having, just with more information." "But you don't think you're wrong." She looked at the foal, who had already identified Lenora as a source of interest and was investigating her coat pocket with a level of optimism that seemed, for an animal with his history, remarkable. "No," she said, "I don't think I'm wrong." She wasn't wrong. It took 11 weeks of daily groundwork, careful manipulation, a series of corrective shoeing adjustments that Calder helped execute, and that Lenora designed from references she'd ordered from a veterinary college in the East. And a patience that never wavered even on the days when the foal's progress reversed, and the angle looked worse than it had the week before. By late February, the foal was walking level. By early March, he was trotting. Marsh came out to see him on a gray morning in the second week of March, and he stood at the fence of the small paddock and watched the foal move and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "He told me to put him down." "I know," Lenora said. "I almost did it." Marsh kept watching the foal. "I almost did it, because 3 men I trusted told me it was the right thing." "I know that, too." He looked at her. He was a big man, Marsh, with the kind of sun-damaged face that came from decades outdoors, and his eyes at that moment had the quality of a man reckoning with something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I said things about you," he said, after Bram. "I listened to Vale, and I said things I shouldn't have." "Yes," Lenora said, "you did." She didn't soften it. She didn't say it's all right, or you didn't know, because it wasn't entirely all right, and he should have known better. She let his statement sit in the accurate weight of it, which was the most honest thing she could do for him. Marsh nodded slowly, accepting this. "Is there anything I can do for you, beyond what I owe for the foal?" Lenora thought for a moment. "Tell people the truth," she said. "Not about me specifically. Just when you see something that isn't right, say so. Even if the person saying the wrong thing has a certificate on their wall." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "That's all?" "That's considerable, actually," she said. He left with his foal an hour later, the animal walking clean and level on the road out of the ranch, and Lenora stood at the gate and watched them go with the expression she got when something had worked, not triumphant, not relieved exactly. Just present in the satisfaction of it the way a craftsperson is present in a thing done correctly. Calder stood beside her. "3 veterinarians," he said. "3 veterinarians," she agreed. "You should charge more." She almost smiled. "I should charge something. I haven't quite worked out the right amount to charge people for being the last option." "It's a specialty service," Calder said. "Specialties command premiums." She did smile, then brief, real, the kind that reached her eyes before she could decide whether to allow it. She turned back toward the barn, and he fell into Fella's step beside her, and neither of them said anything else about it because there was nothing else to say. Spring came to the valley, the way spring came everywhere in Montana tentatively, with reversals, a warm week followed by a late snow that undid the mud temporarily before the mud returned and became permanent. Cottonwoods along the creek started showing green by mid-April. The horses in the south pasture shed their winter coats in patches, which made them look, for about 3 weeks, like something assembled from spare parts. The trial of Orson Vale began on the second Monday of April. Dern's attorneys had secured 2 delays through the winter, which Ferris had anticipated, and which had cost Calder a sustained and deliberate patience that didn't come naturally, but that he'd practiced anyway. The delays worked in some ways in their favor. The Livestock Board's review of Dern's certified horses had turned up 14 animals sold with fraudulent health documentation, several of which had subsequently infected other livestock in their buyers' herds. The buyers were angry in a specific economic way that translated well into testimony. Money made people concrete. Vale's trial came first because his attorneys had finally stopped delaying. The calculation had shifted. Urquhart had been convicted in county court in February, quickly and with the minimum of drama, and the outcome had been what Calder expected: a man at the bottom of a chain of instruction receives the instruction's full weight, while the men above him retain the ability to say they weren't present. Urquhart had received 5 years. He'd accepted it without visible emotion, which suggested he'd made his own calculations and found the arithmetic tolerable compared to the alternative. With Urquhart's conviction on record, and with the livestock board's findings public, and with 2 of Dern's former buyers having filed civil complaints that were now themselves on the public record, structure Vale had existed inside for 20 years had become visible in a way it couldn't be made invisible again. His attorneys knew this. Vale knew this. Vale took a plea. Not to everything. Not to the charge that touched Bram Whitlock directly. His attorneys fought that one, and they fought it with enough technical precision that Ferris told Calder privately it would have been a difficult case to win at trial. The ledger entry being suggestive rather than confessionary. The connection between Vale's decision and Dern's instruction requiring inference a jury might or might not make. Calder had known this was possible. He'd told Lenora. She had received it without pretending it was fine. What Vale pled to was the fraud, 7 years of falsified certifications. Fraudulent professional practice. Conduct resulting in material harm to purchasers of livestock and to the integrity of territorial health certification. He lost his license. He paid a substantial fine that represented most of what he'd accumulated over 20 years of the work. He received 2 years in the territorial facility, which would likely be reduced for cooperation. He did not go free. He did not continue practicing. He did not remain in a position from which he could dismiss another woman's knowledge with a professional air and a condescending diagnosis. Lenora sat in the courtroom when the plea was entered. She sat in the middle of the public gallery, not hidden, not positioned to be seen, just present, in the room, hearing it said aloud in legal language by a man who now had no choice but to say it. Calder sat beside her. When it was over and people were moving, she stayed in her seat for a moment. Calder waited. "He didn't admit Bram," she said quietly. "No. The ledger says what it says. Everyone who reads it knows what it means." She looked at the front of the courtroom where Vale was being spoken to by his attorneys. An old man now he'd aged badly through the winter, the particular aging of someone whose structure has been removed. He knows what it means. He'll live with knowing what it means. "Yes," Calder said. "He will." She stood, straightened her coat, looked once more at Vale, then looked away, not with the decisiveness of someone performing closure, but with the ordinary movement of someone who has seen what she came to see and is ready to leave. They walked out of the courtroom into the April morning, and the light was the particular clean light of spring, the kind that makes everything look like it's been recently washed, and Lenora stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it. "Dern," she said. 6 weeks, Calder said. His attorneys ran out of legitimate delays. "Ferris says the livestock board's findings have made the fraud charges ironclad. The water rights manipulation has its own proceedings running in parallel." He looked at her. "He won't come out of it well. Will he face anything for Bram?" Calder was quiet for a moment. "Ferris believes the prosecutor will allege conspiracy in the broader fraud, which encompasses the decision about Bram as part of the pattern of conduct. Whether a jury finds it proven is," he stopped. "Tried again. It's not sufficient. It never was. But the attempt will be made formally on the record, in front of a jury. Dern will have to sit there and hear it said." Lenora looked at the mountains, which were still snow-capped but greening at their bases, the line of white retreating upward as the season changed. "Bram would have been 40 this spring," she said. Calder didn't fill that with anything. "He would have liked watching all this happen," she said. He was a man who believed in documents, in writing things down, keeping records, making the truth visible. She almost smiled. He would have been very satisfied with a ledger. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," Calder said. She looked at him then, directly, and the thing that passed between them in that look was the particular thing that had been building since a November storm and a mountain trail and a horse that went down on wet granite and brought a man to a gate he hadn't known he was looking for. "He was," she said. "And knowing him doesn't use up the space for anything else." Spent a long time thinking it did. Calder held her gaze. "When did you stop thinking that?" She considered it honestly the way she considered everything. "Somewhere around the time you went back into a burning barn for a horse that belonged to a man who'd called me a fraud." She paused. "Or possibly when you came back after Wolf Creek. I'm not entirely sure of the exact moment." I'm not sure of the exact moment either, Calder said. I know it was before I thought it was. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, I have a foal to check on, and 2 horses arriving from the Dunleavy Ranch for assessment. And you have a deputy who has been managing a marshal's workload alone for longer than is reasonable. I've been talking to Aldous about that, Calder said. There's a possibility of a second deputy being approved. Someone who can handle Wolf Creek on a day-to-day basis, while I operate across a wider territory. He kept his voice even. Which would mean basing somewhere more central than the Wolf Creek boarding house. She looked at him. More central. The ranch sits at a reasonable midpoint, Calder said. Geographically speaking. And it appears to need a second pair of hands on a sustained basis, given the volume of work you're taking on. See. She was quiet for a moment. The courthouse steps, the April light, the mountains with their retreating snow, all of it very still around them. You've been thinking about this. For a while, he admitted. I didn't want to say anything until the proceedings were further along. I didn't want you to think the offer was connected to Mainz. Pity, she said. To anything except what it is, he said. Which is that I would like to stay, not as a lodger and not as a working arrangement, but as stopped. I'm not going to make it sound simpler than it is. We are both people who have been shaped by hard things and who don't fit easily into arrangements built for uncomplicated people. I know that. I am not an easy person, she said. It wasn't self-deprecation, it was information, delivered with the same directness she delivered everything. I know that too, Calder said. I've been watching you work for 5 months. I know exactly what kind of person you are. He met her eyes. I'm not looking for easy. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it, not doubting him, not protecting herself from him, specifically, but doing the honest accounting that a person does when they've been hurt badly enough, that optimism requires justification. He didn't rush it. He'd learned from 5 months of watching Lenora Whitlock that you didn't rush her, and that not rushing her was itself a form of respect she'd register, even if she didn't say so. You'd need a room, she said finally. I have one, he said. I've been sleeping in it for 5 months. A proper arrangement, she said. Not a convenience that we don't define. I agree completely. She looked at him, then looked away at the mountains, then back. I can't promise I'll be different than I am. I don't have a version of myself that's easier or warmer or less likely to tell you when you're wrong. Lenora, he said, I fell into something like love with you while you were telling me a horse needed 3 weeks of rest and it was not my decision to make. I am not expecting different. She went very still. The word he'd used, or the something like version of it, the careful almost version of it, sat in the air between them in the April light. That's the first time you've said anything like that, she said. I've been working up to it. 5 months. I told you I'm not rushing it. She looked at him, and the expression on her face was not the careful, composed expression she usually maintained in exchanges that mattered. It was more unguarded than that the look of someone who has protected something for a long time and is in the process of deciding, right now, in this moment, that the protection has cost more than what it was protecting. I need to check on the foal, she said. I know. And you should send a wire to Aldous about the second deputy application. I will. She turned and walked down the courthouse steps. At the bottom, she stopped without turning around. Calder. Yes. Come home when you're done with the wire. He watched her walk away down the main street of Wolf Creek, straight-backed and purposeful, her coat practical, her stride the stride of a woman who knows where she's going and why. And the word she'd used, home, sat in his chest, with the weight of something that had been looking for that word for a long time. He went and sent the wire. Dern's trial happened in late May, when the valley was fully green and the creek ran clear and fast with snowmelt. It lasted 4 days. Calder testified on the second day, Lenora on the third. She sat before the jury 12 men, was the way of it, and probably would be for some time, and answered every question with the precision and the grounded certainty that had characterized every conversation she'd had since the moment Calder had met her. The defense tried twice to introduce the characterizations that had followed her after Bram's death. Prosecutor objected twice. The judge, a woman who had ridden a circuit through the territory for 8 years and had a well-documented tolerance for exactly 0 procedural games, sustained both objections. On the fourth day, the jury found Silas Dern guilty on 7 counts of fraud, 2 counts of property crimes connected to the arson and creek poisoning, and 1 count of conspiracy in the broader scheme, a conspiracy that the prosecutor argued. And the jury accepted, encompassed the decision that had left Bram Whitlock untreated. It wasn't the charge Calder had wanted most. It wasn't the word murder in any form that the law recognized. But it was conspiracy, and it was on the record, and the judge's sentencing remarks made clear that the court understood what the conspiracy had cost. Dern received 12 years. He sat at the defendant's table and received this with the stillness of a man who has calculated every possible outcome and arrived at one he cannot renegotiate. His attorneys were already talking about appeal before the gavel came down. They would appeal. It would take time and money, and the breeding empire that had funded it was already in pieces. The fraudulent certifications had unwound his reputation in a market that ran on reputation. And buyers who'd lost livestock to the diseases his falsely certified horses had carried were pursuing civil claims that would occupy his attorneys for years, regardless of the criminal outcome. Calder stood outside the courtroom afterward in the mace and thought about Bram Whitlock, who had been 40 this spring and wasn't, and about the ledger entry that said situation to be managed, and about the 12 years that were the law's best accounting of what that management had cost. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be exactly enough. That was the thing about justice that people who hadn't worked in law enforcement for 20 years sometimes didn't understand. The accounting never comes out even. The debt is real. The repayment is the best available approximation of real, and the gap between the two is where grief lives, permanently, and you learn to carry it alongside the outcome rather than instead of it. He found Lenora on the courthouse steps. She was looking at nothing in particular, her hands in her coat pockets, her face doing the quiet internal work she did when she was processing something she hadn't finished with yet. 12 years, he said. I heard. She was quiet for a moment. It won't bring Bram back. No, he'll appeal, yes. It'll be reduced, probably. The conspiracy count is the most legally complex piece. That's where they'll focus. She looked at him. I know all of that. She looked back at the street. I'm not disappointed in the outcome. I'm trying to find the word for what this is. He waited. Completion, she said finally. Not happiness, not peace exactly. Just the thing is finished. It went as far as it goes, and now it's finished. She pulled one hand from her pocket and looked at it, the palm, where the burns from the barn fire had healed into a slight shining of the skin that would be there permanently. He knew. Dern knew about Bram, and Vale let Bram die, and a jury said so in front of people. It's not nothing. It's not nothing, Calder said. It's not what I wanted for 3 years. What did you want for 3 years? She was quiet. I wanted to be believed, she said. Before anything else, before consequences, before justice, before any of it, I just wanted someone to look at what I knew and say yes. You know this. You were right. She looked at him. Rourke stopped the defense attorney when he tried to make me doubt myself. I think about that more than the verdict. That was the thing about knowledge that people with authority had tried to take from you. The return of it mattered more than the punishment of the people who'd done the taking. You could live with imperfect justice. What was harder to live with was the ongoing implication that your own clear-eyed understanding of the world was unreliable. You were right, Calder said. You've been right from the beginning. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, let's go home. They were married in June, beneath the cottonwood trees beside the rebuilt barn, on a morning that was warm without being hot, the creek running clear in the background, the horses in the south pasture moving slowly through the long grass. It was not a large wedding. Lenora was not a woman who required ceremony to make things real, and Calder was not a man who had ever been comfortable in the center of an occasion. Harriet Bledsoe was there, and Hadley, and Aldous, who had ridden out from Wolf Creek with the slightly stunned expression of who has learned his superior, has been making different arrangements than expected, and is quietly adjusting his understanding of several months of events. The Dunleavy family came. Marsh came and brought his foal, now a sound yearling with a clean stride, because Marsh had decided this was an appropriate gift, and nobody had disagreed. The judge who'd presided over the Dern trial had agreed to perform the ceremony. which she did with the efficient warmth of a woman who'd seen enough of human difficulty to understand that the moments of its opposite deserved full attention. Lenora wore a dress that was neither extravagant nor plain, somewhere between the two, in a color that resolved her eyes toward green more definitively than Calder had ever managed to determine them in ordinary light. Carried nothing. She stood under the cottonwood tree and said what she meant to say directly, without flourish, and her voice was steady because she had decided it would be steady, and that was the kind of woman she was. Calder said what he meant too, in the simple language of someone who'd spent 20 years watching how words turned into either truth or performance, and had a strong preference for the former. He promised her the things he could actually deliver: his honesty, his presence, his willingness to work beside her and be corrected by her and never mistake her knowledge for something that required his endorsement to be valid. He did not promise her smoothness. He did not promise her an easy road. He was 58 years old and she was 31, and they were both people with histories that had not been uncomplicated. And promising each other anything frictionless would have been an insult to what they'd actually seen of each other. What he promised her was real. She held it accordingly. Nightwind, in the paddock nearby, called once during the ceremony in his particular low tone, which made several people laugh, including Lenora, the laugh that reached her eyes before she could contain it. "I think he's objecting," Aldous said. "He's approving," Lenora said. "He just does it loud." After, there was food and the ordinary noise of people gathered together, and Calder stood at the fence of the south pasture for a while by himself, looking at the rebuilt barn solid, straight, larger than the original, because the people who'd built it had decided larger was more honest than replicating what had been lost, and at the horses moving in the grass, and at the mountains going blue in the afternoon light. He thought about a night in November, the rain, the mountain trail, the moment Nightwind's leg went wrong, and the whole careful plan of his life shifted under his feet the way the ground shifts in a moment of unsteadiness. He'd cursed that moment. He'd cursed the storm and the trail, and his own urgency that had pushed the horse past the point he should have been pushed. He'd been wrong about what kind of moment it was. The thing about life, or the thing Calder had worked out slowly over the 58 years of it, was that the moments that feel like failures of planning are sometimes something else entirely. Storm wasn't bad luck. The injury wasn't an obstacle. They were the mechanism by which the plan he'd been making, without knowing he was making it, finally executed. You couldn't arrange this kind of thing. You couldn't plan your way to the right gate in the right storm with the right injury at the right time. What you could do was go through the gate when you reached it, and pay attention to what was on the other side, and not be so committed to where you were headed that you couldn't recognize when you'd arrived. He heard Lenora's footsteps behind him and didn't turn around. She came and stood beside him at the fence in the way she had, close enough that their arms touched, looking at the same pasture. "Aldous is wondering," she said, "whether you plan to go back to Wolf Creek at all this week, or whether he should consider himself the permanent marshal." "I'll go Thursday," Calder said. "There's a fence on the east side that needs the final post set first." "I can set the post." "I know you can. I'd like to do it." She looked at the pasture. Nightwind was at the far end, moving in that easy way he'd developed since the tendon healed looser than before, actually, as though the injury and the recovery had worked out some long-standing stiffness and left him with a stride that suited him better than what he'd had. "He runs better than before," she said. "I noticed that." The tendon formed back with slightly different geometry. Not every injury heals into the original shape. She watched the horse. Sometimes it heals into something better. He looked at her profile, the clean line of it, the quiet attention she gave everything, the almost smile that lived at the corner of her mouth when she was looking at something she found satisfying. "Is that a metaphor?" he asked. "It's an observation about horses," she said. "Make of it what you will." He made of it what seemed accurate, and kept it to himself, and stood at the fence of the ranch that had been a refuge and become a home, beside the woman who had built both designations through the sustained work of her own hands and the stubborn refusal to let other people's limitations define the boundaries of what she knew. There are things that people who live in the wide-open spaces of the American West understand about value that people in other places sometimes miss. That worth is not determined by consensus. That a thing can be true even when everyone around you says otherwise. That the person who knows what they know and doesn't apologize for knowing it, even when the knowing costs them, that person is the most reliable kind, because they are not performing for an audience. They are simply stubbornly, accurately themselves. Lenora Whitlock had been that person through the loneliest years of her life. She'd been it when the town said no. She'd been it when the doctor said no. She'd been it in the burning barn, in the poisoned creek, in the courtroom, in the long cold winter of working on a foal that 3 qualified men had deemed not worth the effort. She'd been right about all of it, not because she was extraordinary in the way stories sometimes make people extraordinary, elevated above normal frailty, made invincible by suffering. She was not invincible. She was tired some mornings and wrong occasionally and unable, still, to find the easy path to forgiving people who'd hurt her, because grace of that kind didn't come naturally and she'd stopped pretending it did. But she was honest, and she was capable, and she kept records. She got back up. That was the thing worth knowing. Not that the good survive and the guilty are punished in neat proportion to their crimes. They aren't. The accounting is always uneven. The gap between what justice is and what justice does is wide and permanent, and anyone who tells otherwise is selling comfort at the expense of accuracy. What was worth knowing was simpler, that the person who keeps bearing witness, even when no one is listening, eventually makes the truth too large to ignore. That documentation is a form of dignity. That showing up for the work, day after day, caring for the animals nobody else will take, setting the compress at first light and checking the tendon at nightfall, and writing it all down, that this is not a small life. That is, in fact, the life. Nightwind came to the fence eventually, the way he always did, the way he'd first come to Lenora in the storm, before she or Calder had understood what that gesture meant. He pushed his nose between them with the proprietary ease of a horse who has decided he is central to whatever is happening and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Lenora put her hand on his face. Calder put his beside hers. Cottonwoods moved in the June wind. The creek ran clear below the rebuilt barn. Somewhere behind them, Hadley's laugh rose briefly above the sound of the gathering, and Aldous said something that provoked it, and the afternoon light came gold and long across the pasture, where the horses moved in the tall grass. Every one of them alive, every one of them there, because someone had decided they were worth the work. Calder thought, not for the first time and not for the last, Nightwind wasn't lost on that mountain. He was finding his way home. He just needed the storm to show him the gate.